31-year-old Lisa Tony was a career-minded homebody with little excitement in her life.
She was stable, professional, down to earth.
But that all changed when she met 27-year-old playboy Yankee Lalamond.
Yankee Lalamond was sexually gifted and had no problem sharing those gifts.
Yankee has the ability to make you the only woman in the room.
Their fiery romance was fueled by insatiable desire.
It's explosive. It's energizing.
Sex, like fireworks.
Until a horrific explosion brought it all crashing down around them.
It was an extraordinary scene. It was horrendous. Shrapnel right in the heart.
Now, follow detectives as they dig clues from the rubble to solve a bizarre case full of lust, greed, and betrayal.
Fraud, con artistry, sexual extortion.
This is a perfect example of passion gone wrong.
February 15th, 2000. It was just after 10:45 p.m. in Chicago when a South Side neighborhood was rocked by a sudden explosion.
Enough to reverberate through the neighborhood, set off car alarms. It was heard from blocks away.
First responders rushed to the scene at South Muskegon Avenue to find complete chaos.
The house was blown out, the windows and everything.
It's chaotic. There is debris everywhere.
The house was in ruins, and lying on the sidewalk amongst the debris was a badly burned body.
He suffered tremendous trauma.
The man appeared to have been blown out the front door of the house by the force of the explosion. Luckily, he was still alive, but just barely. Paramedics quickly rushed him to the ER. At the same time, firefighters entered the home and quickly found a second victim.
There is a dead body in the house.
It was an extraordinary scene. It was horrendous.
Based on the damage, it was obvious to seasoned investigators what had caused the blast.
The fire department determined that a bomb had gone off.
But who had detonated it, and why? The answer to those questions would lay bare a horrifying crime, along with a white-hot tale of deceit, greed, and murder. The South Side of Chicago is known for its high crime rate. But for Lisa Tony, growing up in the Windy City was full of happy memories. Born in 1957, Lisa was the daughter of two loving civil servants.
Father was an employee of the sheriff department. Her mother was an educator. They had a nice house.
She was very close with her family.
When it came to her future career, Lisa's parents raised her to be ambitious and independent. But when it came to marriage, they taught their daughter a more old-fashioned approach.
To be a good wife, to put the man first, to take care of your home, Lisa Tony learned early what was expected of her.
Once out of college, Lisa landed a job in human resources at a large Chicago corporation, where she put her strong work ethic to good use.
She was ambitious, but also stable, professional, down to earth, very loyal, dedicated. She was rising through the ranks.
Then, in her mid-30s, Lisa met a man who shared her hardworking values. Marcus Tony.
Marcus Tony was a custodian at city colleges. He also purchased rental properties and rehabbed them, made them nicer, spiffed them up, and then rented them out.
And also like Lisa, Marcus had rather conservative beliefs when it came to the roles of husband and wife.
Marcus wanted a traditional marriage. He wanted a woman who would take care of the house and he would take care of the finances. And he and Lisa shared in this belief.
Following a brief courtship, Marcus and Lisa married in 1994. Funds were tight at first, and the couple had bills to pay, so Lisa kept working. But on nights and weekends, Lisa did her best to fill her role of devoted housewife.
She doted upon him. She did his laundry. She laid out his work uniform daily and made sure that he was taken care of.
In return, Marcus did his part to make sure he and Lisa were both taken care of, at least for the future.
He paid all his bills on time. When he had extra money, he wanted to invest it rather than spend it frivolously.
For the next few years, Marcus and Lisa enjoyed a simple but happy life together. But in 1998, that happiness was shaken up when 41-year-old Lisa took a walk through her Southside Chicago neighborhood. As she neared her home, her eyes locked with a hot young guy playing with a little girl across the street. The man introduced himself as the girl's uncle, 27-year-old Yankee Lalamond.
6'2", good looking, is dressed very nice. Handsome guy.
He has the gift of gab. He's very charming, knows what to say.
Lisa was mesmerized by Yankee's tall, athletic build, but little did she know that the brief encounter would change her life forever. Born in 1971, Yankee spent the first year of his life in Haiti, where his father was a well-known athlete.
He is the son of an Olympic soccer player.
His dad was pretty famous.
Eventually, the Lalamond family left Haiti and relocated to Chicago. But as Yankee grew older, he realized that unlike his father, his natural talent wasn't on the soccer field. It was his ability to influence and manipulate those around him.
Sankey's craft became a brilliant ability to read people.
He pays very close attention to everything you're saying, everything you're doing, everything about your body language. He is trying to figure you out.
And Yankee's intuition was particularly useful when it came to the opposite sex.
Yankee has the ability to make you the only woman in the room.
But it wasn't only Yankee's charm that won the ladies over.
Yankee Lalamond was sexually gifted and had no problem sharing those gifts. He's a sexual dynamo.
In 1998, 27-year-old Yankee was between relationships. He temporarily moved into his mother's Chicago home, directly across the street from Lisa and Marcus Tony. One afternoon, Yankee spotted Lisa. And Yankee never wasted an opportunity to flirt with an attractive woman.
Yankee gave a hello, how you doing today? Just trying to get a read on her.
The conversation was brief, but Lisa was captivated by Yankee's confidence and charm.
After that initial meeting, she had a little smile on her face, a little skip in her step.
Lisa started looking out her window more often, seeing if Yankee's car was nearby, seeing if he was rocking up to her block.
Over the following weeks, Lisa went out of her way to walk past Yankee's mother's house. And each time she stopped to chat with Yankee, the sexual tension between them grew.
There was a spark of excitement and attraction.
Lisa's encounters with Yankee stirred up feelings she didn't know she had. She found herself spending more and more time fantasizing about Yankee and less time doting over her husband.
She started to really withdraw from her relationship with Marcus.
Before she met Yankee, cheating on Marcus would have been unthinkable. But with every encounter she had with her new, sexy neighbor, it was beginning to feel inevitable. Especially with Yankee working hard to win her over.
He became more and more explicit in his sexual and physical interest in her.
Eventually, it became too much for Lisa to resist. Pushing guilt aside, Lisa gave in to Yankee's advances. And once she did, any hesitation she had about having an affair instantly disappeared.
When they finally do have sex, it's like fireworks.
And it wasn't just Yankee's extensive skills in the bedroom that had Lisa hooked. She was surprised to find out that instead of her taking care of a man was taking care of her.
kind of sweeps her off her feet. He takes her to hotels, downtown Chicago. They have fancy meals. He just introduces her to a life that she wasn't having at home.
Despite their intimacy, however, Lisa knew little about Cianci, and even less about where he got the money to pay for their romantic getaways.
He really did not give any indication about what he did for a living.
But after a lifetime of playing by the rules, Lisa enjoyed the mystery that surrounded her new lover.
They started really going strong, and they were in a full-fledged relationship.
Lisa couldn't bear the thought of telling Marcus she was in love with Cianci. Instead, in the fall of 1999, Lisa kept the affair to herself and simply asked Marcus to move out. To her relief, Marcus, who'd sensed the decline in their marriage over the past year, agreed. No longer burdened with the pressure of having to hide their love affair, Lisa and Cianci began dating publicly, and their romance kicked into high gear.
Every romantic encounter they have is building her bond to him. And he's in it 100% as well.
For the first time in their lives, Lisa and Cianci enjoyed both the thrill of passion and the power of true love. But the couple's red-hot romance was about to take a horrific turn. Coming up, investigators discover a suspicious package at the crime scene.
We found remnants of a wrapping paper. This box contained the device.
And learn of a victim living in fear.
He had suspicions that his identity had been stolen and that something dangerous was happening to him.
For nearly a year, Lisa Tony and Cianci Lalaman kept their steamy affair a secret. But by the fall of 1999, Lisa left her husband Marcus, and her romance with Cianci seemed unstoppable.
She's completely in love with him. She can't live without him.
For the next 6 months, it looked like she wouldn't have to. But as Lisa and Cianci lost themselves in their love affair, investigators on the south side of Chicago found themselves dealing with an outright disaster. Just after 10 p.m. on February 15th, a sudden blast demolished a small home on South Muskegon Avenue.
The scene was chaos. It bowed out the whole front of the house. It ripped apart walls.
When first responders got to the scene, they found one victim badly burned, but still alive. But inside, they discovered another victim who hadn't been so lucky.
He was dead, obviously deceased.
Based on the damage, investigators on the scene came up with a theory about what caused the devastation.
The fire department determined that the bomb had gone off.
That theory was confirmed when investigators made a shocking discovery in the living room.
It was an intact explosive device. There was actually 2 pipe bombs involved. One actually exploded, the other was fully intact.
Fearful that the unexploded bomb could go off at any second, firefighters cleared the scene as bomb technicians raced to dismantle it.
It was an extremely tight situation.
It was a pipe about so big and about so long. Had end caps on both sides and had a triggering mechanism. Chicago Bomb and Arson came out and disposed of the second device.
With the device safely disarmed, the scene was finally open to investigators, and a quick examination of the man's body made it clear the explosion had killed him instantly.
This is a human being that died a terrible death.
I mean, it completely blew him apart.
The dead body was identified as belonging to the homeowner, 37-year-old Marcus Tony. As investigators surveyed the scene, they found evidence that the pipe bomb had gone off just inches away from Marcus's body.
A gaping hole in the living room floor. It went to the floor and then spewed all kinds of shrapnel onto the walls.
But what were 2 explosive devices doing in the house to begin with? Had someone planted them there? As they continued their search, detectives began to find bits and pieces of a puzzle that suggested a possible answer.
They see a piece of cardboard, and then somebody else finds another piece of cardboard.
It was in a VCR box.
We found remnants of gift wrapping paper. We come up with the theory right there that this box contained the device.
And among the scattered pieces of the cardboard box, they found another clue.
I noticed a FedEx label. Then the puzzle starts coming together.
The label was addressed to Marcus Tony, which meant someone had sent Marcus the bombs through the mail. But who had sent the deadly package, and why?
This was a methodical crime. This was something that took a lot of planning, a lot of timing, and a lot of expertise.
Unfortunately, the shipping label was too damaged to indicate where the box had come from. But detectives did find an important piece of evidence that had survived the blast.
Marcus's cell phone was recovered from the scene.
Police sent Marcus's phone off for analysis, hoping they might find something to suggest the identity of the bomber or shed light on the motive for the crime. In the meantime, detectives paid a visit to the one person they hoped might be able to help them. Marcus's estranged wife, 42-year-old Lisa Tony.
Marcus's neighbors tell them he and Lisa are separated, so they go by her house early that morning to talk to her.
Police informed Lisa that there had been an explosion and her husband had died in that explosion.
Lisa was devastated by the news, but she said she couldn't think of a reason why anyone would want to hurt Marcus.
I got the picture of a straightforward, hard-working guy.
He didn't have enemies. He wasn't involved in the criminal underworld. He had no criminal history at all.
Lisa explained that even though she and Marcus were separated, they still cared very much for one another. And when police contacted Marcus's family, they echoed the sentiment.
It didn't appear to have any tension or any drama. We would talk about how she would come over and help and cook for him.
Family members told police that the 37-year-old had more pressing concerns on his mind than his marriage troubles. They said Marcus had been spooked ever since a mysterious package arrived on his doorstep 1 week before the explosion. Marcus told his family that the package contained a box that had been gift wrapped, and he peeled back the wrapping enough to see that it was a VCR box. But instead of opening it, he set the package aside.
He goes against what would be most people's impulse to just rip open the package.
But why didn't Marcus open the box as soon as he got it? Marcus's family believed that he feared what the box contained, but not because he thought it was a bomb.
Marcus complained that someone had been fraudulently using his credit card, and he suspected that this VCR was one of the things that Thief purchased.
He had suspicions that something was going on, that his identity had been stolen.
But if that were true, then why had Marcus finally decided to open the box? As police would soon learn, Marcus hadn't just received a suspicious package. He'd also gotten several mysterious voicemail messages. And what they said was both disturbing and terrifying.
These messages were eerie, they were scary, telling Marcus that he was being watched.
Coming up, police uncover a taunting message from the bomber.
Why don't you just open up your little gift and, take a look at what I sent you.
And evidence hints at both the killer's motive and identity.
They found a long criminal history of sexual extortion.
By February of 2000, the passionate love affair between 42-year-old Lisa Tony and 29-year-old Siyanki Lalamond had reached a fever pitch.
It's explosive. It's energizing.
But Lisa's red-hot romance had taken an unexpected turn on the night of February 15th, when a pipe bomb explosion killed her estranged husband, 37-year-old Marcus Tony, and critically injured his friend. Police believe someone had sent the bomb to Marcus inside a gift-wrapped VCR box.
This was a meticulous murderer who had to put considerable planning and timing into making sure that Marcus would be killed in such a horrific fashion.
Shocked and confused, Lisa told police that Marcus was a hardworking man with no enemies. However, when investigators spoke to Marcus's family, they revealed that Marcus feared he had at least one adversary. He suspected for some time that someone had stolen his identity.
He had told his family there was a lot of credit card charges that he knew nothing about.
That fear had increased when Marcus received a suspicious package 8 days prior to the explosion.
Marcus Tony received this box about a week before Valentine's Day, and he was hesitant to open it.
Marcus apparently worried that the gift-wrapped VCR had been purchased illegally in his name. And family members told investigators that he'd even attempted to turn the package over to police.
He went to make a report of deceptive practice, which is when someone uses someone else's credit card.
But the desk officer taking Marcus's report apparently hadn't been convinced there was evidence of fraud.
There was no proof the VCR had been purchased by someone else. They told Marcus he should just return the package if he didn't order it.
So he took it back with him, back to the house, and mulled around for a while.
Police believe that Marcus finally decided to open the package on the night of February 15th. It was a decision that ended his life and severely injured his friend.
A horrendous explosion. It blew off his feet, blew off an arm, and shrapnel pierced him right in the heart.
But why had Marcus changed his mind and opened the package? While family members couldn't be sure, they told police it might have been related to the strange messages Marcus said he'd been getting on his phone.
There was a male caller that left several voice messages for Marcus Tony.
Investigators searched Marcus's cell phone and discovered that, fortunately, he had saved the suspicious voicemails. And when detectives listened to the message, they heard something disturbing.
These messages were eerie.
Why don't you just open up your little gift
They were scary.
and, take a look at what I sent you.
Telling Marcus that he was being watched.
Whoever was threatening him was telling him to open up the bomb package.
But who was the man leaving Marcus the disturbing messages?
We had no idea who this person was, and we really kicked the investigation into high gear.
Investigators started with Marcus's own suspicions that he was the victim of fraud. And when they looked into his financial records, they found Marcus had more than just suspicions. He had proof of someone using his identity to open new credit card accounts.
He had hundreds of thousands of dollars of credit card charges. There were cash withdrawals, made big cash withdrawals.
The fraudulent charges totaled almost $300,000, many of them for luxuries such as diamond earrings, designer clothes, and hotel suites.
Whoever was doing this had some expensive taste, and they were not being all that careful about it.
A Mercedes-Benz had been bought in his name.
When police contacted Marcus's credit card companies, they discovered he'd been in the process of trying to clear his name. It also appeared Marcus had even told his creditors that he had an idea of who he thought was defrauding him.
We had Marcus Tony's statements to the credit card companies that his wife, Lisa Tony, was defrauding him.
But apparently Marcus had suspected that Lisa wasn't working alone.
He believed his wife and her boyfriend opened up fraudulent credit cards in his name.
It seemed that Marcus had learned about Lisa and Cianki's romance. And investigators wondered, could Lisa's boyfriend be the mystery man heard on his voicemail? Armed with this new information, police decided to pay Lisa another visit. But Lisa claimed she didn't know anything about the credit card fraud or threatening messages. Not only that, she told police she didn't have a boyfriend anymore. Even though her romantic relationship with Cianki Lalamond had led to the end of her marriage, Lisa told police that she and Cianki were no longer a couple. She claimed they split up not long after she and Marcus had separated. But she did admit that she stayed in contact with Cianki, albeit strictly on a professional level.
She denied having a relationship with this individual, but she claimed he was some kind of financial counselor.
Lisa speculated that Cianki might have gotten access to Marcus's account while helping her through her own financial problems.
He was providing some type of credit counseling and would have had access to Marcus Tony's personal information.
When police ran a background check on Cianki Lalamond, they quickly discovered that if he was behind the fraud, it wouldn't be the first time.
They found a long criminal history of fraud, con artistry, sexual extortion.
He's a convicted felon.
In 1992, Cianki served 18 months in a Michigan prison for blackmailing a lover with videotapes of their sexual encounters. Even more surprising, his target hadn't been a woman, but a man.
At the time, Cianki was living near a nature reserve used as a hangout for gay men looking for anonymous sex. A lot of these guys were trying to keep their sexual orientation on the down low, so Cianki figured it was the perfect setup for blackmail.
Cianki had apparently used his powers of seduction to lure one of the men to his apartment, where he videotaped the sexual encounter and threatened to make it public if the victim didn't pay up.
Cianki even mailed a copy of the tape to the guy's wife, but it didn't quite work out the way that he planned.
Cianki's attempts at blackmail backfired when the victim notified the FBI. But now that he was out of jail, police wondered if Lisa Tony's theory might be right.
The police heard this name and looked into the background of Cianki Lalamond.
He's got a history of seducing people and taking advantage of them, male or female. It did not seem to matter.
But police knew just because Cianki was capable of fraud, that didn't mean he was also capable of killing Marcus Tony. And there was no evidence he had the technical knowledge or skill required to build an explosive device. With no other leads connecting Cianki to the bomb, detectives felt like they'd hit a dead end. So they decided to re-examine the murder weapon and take a closer look at the fragments of the gift wrapping paper the pipe bomb had been wrapped in.
They're hoping if they can find where the paper was bought, that might lead them to the killer.
Eventually, police were able to trace the paper to a Chicago department store. And in a stroke of luck, a clerk remembered wrapping the VCR in that particular paper just a few weeks before. Even more surprising, she remembered the man who brought it in.
She remembered the individual because he gave her a very large tip.
It was a young, very well-dressed, attractive African-American male.
Police showed the woman photos of several suspects, and without hesitation, she pointed out the man who paid her to gift wrap the VCR box, Cianki Lalamond.
She remembered specifically him and was able to pick him out in the photo lineup.
Cianki had just become the #1 suspect in Marcus Tony's murder. But police couldn't help but wonder, why would Cianki decide to put an end to his illegal cash flow by killing Marcus? And what, if anything, did Lisa Tony have to do with the crime? Coming up, a bizarre twist seems to turn the case upside down.
She's a drag queen with a rap sheet for blackmail and fraud.
And detectives discover evidence of a new motive for the crime.
Mark's insurance policy was going to be a big windfall.
When Lisa Tony left her husband for Cianki Lalamond, she thought she met the man who could finally give her the passion and excitement she'd been missing.
Cianki comes into the picture, all suave and debonair, offering her the moon and the stars.
It was sexy, it was seductive.
But Cianki gave Lisa much more than she bargained for. And police now considered him the prime suspect in the bombing that killed Lisa's estranged husband, Marcus Tony, and gravely injured Marcus's close friend.
The package that had been gift wrapped was sent to his house. Inside it contained a bomb. So when he unwrapped the package, it exploded.
When questioned by detectives, Lisa claimed that Cianki wasn't her lover, but a financial planner responsible for defrauding Marcus of almost $300,000.
She may have accidentally given him identification information of Marcus Tony, which he must then have used to acquire these fraudulent credit cards.
And Cienki's criminal record, including blackmail and credit fraud, seemed to support Lisa's claims. That is, until investigators pulled security footage from Marcus Tony's bank and discovered that a woman had been making withdrawals. But it wasn't Lisa Tony.
The bank footage shows this strange woman making withdrawals from Marcus's account posing as Lisa.
But who was the woman pretending to be Lisa? Police ran the image through their criminal database and made a shocking discovery. The woman pretending to be Lisa was a local resident named Sherry Payne.
She's a drag queen performing in a Chicago burlesque show with a rap sheet for blackmail and fraud.
Sherry's real name was Joseph Burkhart. She'd been undergoing a sex change treatment to become a woman for years. She and Cienki Lalamond had a long and colorful history together.
She and Cienki had been in a sexual relationship for 6 years and worked together as con artists.
Police immediately tracked Sherry down, and when cornered, it didn't take long for her to confess to helping Cienki pull off credit scams on the many different women he dated.
Cienki would seduce women, and once he got access to their bank and credit card statements, he would then use Sherry to make the withdrawals.
Sherry's confession gave police the evidence they needed to issue a warrant for Cienki's arrest. But Sherry claimed she had no idea where her partner in crime was now. Authorities issued an APB for Cienki Lalamond, but police couldn't find any trace of him anywhere in the U.S. It was as though he'd vanished into thin air.
He became a fugitive from day one.
Months passed with no sign of Cienki anywhere. To narrow their search, investigators looked into a few more of Cienki's past acquaintances, which led them to an old prison pal.
We learned that there was an individual also incarcerated in Michigan that had a background in bombing.
The inmate was 21-year-old Jason Butcher, who had prior arrests for illegal explosives. Detectives wondered, had Cienki enlisted Jason's help to build the bomb that killed Marcus Tony? When police ran a background check on Jason, they discovered that he'd made some interesting purchases in the weeks before Marcus Tony's death.
Purchases made at a sporting goods store for gunpowder, for rocket motor igniters.
All of the items Jason bought turned out to be ingredients used to make homemade explosives. Armed with a list of purchases, investigators brought Jason down to the police station. And the young man was quick to admit his involvement with Cienki. Jason claimed that Cienki asked him for his help in making a pipe bomb, but he never said what he intended to do with it. Like Sherry, Jason also claimed to have no idea where Cienki was now. But when police reminded Jason of the serious charges he was facing, he agreed to help them find his old cellmate.
We sat down with Jason, and basically he had a choice to make, to possibly face the death penalty or to assist us on our investigation.
Carefully monitored by investigators, Jason reached out to Cienki through email. After several unanswered messages, detectives began to lose hope. Days passed with no response, and police started to wonder if Cienki might have figured out they were onto him, and if they'd lost their best chance to catch him. But then one day, Cienki wrote back.
It was just a simple, I'm out there and I'm okay.
Using the unique identifiers attached to the email, detectives were able to pinpoint the computer to a home in Los Angeles that belonged to an affluent 52-year-old woman named Sandra Lavelle.
They figure Cienki's probably holed up in this woman's house, so they stake it out.
They wouldn't have to wait very long. Soon after police put the house under surveillance, they spotted a man fitting Cienki's description sneaking out of the house with bandages on his face.
He's had plastic surgery to alter his physical appearance.
But Cienki's attempt to disguise himself had failed. Detectives were still able to positively ID him and quickly moved in to make the arrest. Once in police custody, Cienki confessed that he'd gone on the run after the bombing. But that's not all he was willing to tell investigators. According to Cienki, Lisa Tony wasn't the innocent victim she appeared to be. He claimed that he and Lisa hadn't broken up after her separation. In fact, Cienki said they were still lovers, and her husband's murder had been her idea.
She talked to Lauman and suggested that we've got to do something about this because he's going to go to the police. We're all going to get in trouble.
It was a surprising story, but outside Cienki's testimony, police had nothing to connect Lisa to the crime.
The police can't pin anything on Lisa. She wasn't the one that is at all linked to the pipe bomb.
If prosecutors wanted to charge and convict Lisa, they needed Cienki's help. So they approached him with an offer they knew he couldn't refuse.
Cienki Lalaman agreed to plead guilty. In exchange for that, the government took the death penalty off the table.
As part of his plea agreement, Cienki came clean about his involvement with Lisa Tony. But Cienki told police that sex wasn't the only thing Lisa was after.
She wanted to be with somebody who could afford the nicer things in life.
Cienki said he indulged Lisa's expensive tastes for as long as possible. But when his cash ran out, they both came up with a plan to gain access to steal the money they needed from Lisa's estranged husband, Marcus Tony.
Lauman was an expert on identity theft and kind of showed her how it's done, basically.
Cienki told police that Lisa provided him with the information to obtain credit cards in Marcus's name. And soon, they were living in a life of luxury. But when Marcus discovered that his identity had been stolen, it didn't take him long to put two and two together.
Now she's driving a Mercedes and she's going shopping at all these fancy stores. All this is happening at the same time that tens of thousands of dollars are being stolen from me.
And from the start, Marcus had suspected that Lisa wasn't acting alone. When he confronted Lisa about it, she and Cienki realized they had a serious problem.
That was a game changer. Now he's not just the husband that they're fooling. He's the man who's a threat.
But Cienki told police that he and Lisa didn't panic. Instead, Lisa came up with a plan that would keep them both out of jail and keep them rolling in money.
Lisa told Cienki that she had an insurance policy on her husband.
Lisa was a sole beneficiary of a $90,000 policy.
Cienki told investigators that over the following weeks, he and Lisa had carefully planned Marcus's death.
They were acting hand in hand the entire time. The bomb was actually built in her house.
Once the deadly package was delivered, Lisa even helped Cienki leave the voicemails urging Marcus to open it.
They just hadn't counted on Marcus's friend being there when he opened the package. So they had two victims instead of one.
Cienki claimed that after the explosion, he got nervous and fled to Jamaica. The plan had been for Lisa to send Cienki money to fly back when she got the insurance payout. But Marcus's murder investigation meant Lisa never got a check, and Cienki never got his half of the cash. Broke and stranded in Jamaica, he ended up wooing an attractive tourist named Sandra Lavelle, who he convinced to fly him back to the U.S. and even foot the bill for his plastic surgery that he hoped would help avoid identification by police. Following his statement, authorities charged Cienki Lalaman with murder and secured a warrant for Lisa Tony. On September 28th, she was taken into custody at work.
My office was more comfortable with charging her with the murders.
But as prosecutors prepared their case, they couldn't help but wonder, would the word of a known con man hold up against his lover in court? Coming up, Lisa Tony takes the stand in her own defense.
She claimed she was simply a victim.
Lisa Tony and Cienki Lalaman spent more than a year caught up in an illicit affair, fueled by passion and greed. But by the spring of 2002, the couple had been arrested and charged with the murder of Lisa's estranged husband after defrauding him of almost $300,000.
A pipe bomb in a wrapped gift so that when Mark opened it, it would explode on him and kill him.
With little direct evidence to connect Lisa to the murder, Prosecutors had struck a deal with Cianki in exchange for his testimony. But as the trial neared, prosecutors worried about putting a convicted felon on the stand.
He was clearly a lowlife. We weren't going to call him as a witness in our case.
However, based on Cianki's statements, prosecutors were able to present the jury with new evidence when Lisa's trial began on February 19, 2003. Comparing Lisa's cell phone records with a reconstructed timeline, they attempted to prove that Lisa was a co-conspirator in the plot to kill her husband.
Whether it be buying the parts for the bomb, building the bomb, placing the bomb, she was actually on the phone with Lalaman when these things were occurring.
Prosecutors also called Cianki's former lover and partner in crime to the stand, Sherry Payne.
Sherry testified that she helped Lisa and Cianki with the plan to defraud Marcus Tony. So this proved that Lisa was an active participant from the start.
She had to be knowingly involved in this fraudulent conduct.
When Lisa Tony took the stand in her own defense, she insisted she had nothing to do with her husband's death.
Their defense was that this was all Cianki Lalaman's doing and not hers. She was simply a victim.
On March 7th, the jury finally announced that they had reached a verdict. Lisa Tony was found guilty of conspiring with her lover to defraud and murder her estranged husband, Marcus.
Trial court sentenced her to 27 years.
A few weeks later, Cianki Lalamand faced his own sentencing. Cianki's plea agreement ensured he would not get the death penalty. However, his punishment was still severe.
Cianki was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences in prison.
With his killers behind bars, Marcus's family was left to wonder at the depth of selfishness and greed that led his estranged wife to murder him. Caught up in the passion and excitement of the illicit affair, Lisa Tony had been transformed from a cheating spouse to a cold-blooded murderer.
When you mix love and sex and money, it turns into a very volatile situation.
This is a perfect example of passion gone wrong.
In the early 1980s, across the American Midwest, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Young men and teenagers were disappearing, and later, their bodies were being discovered in places that seemed disconnected from the lives they had been living. Some were found in rural areas. Others were discovered near locations that could be reached easily from major highways. The victims did not all come from the same place, and their cases did not initially appear to belong to a single investigation. But gradually, the geography began to tell a different story. Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin. One body, then another. One missing young man, followed by another. Investigators were no longer looking at isolated tragedies. They were beginning to confront the possibility of a killer who could move across state lines, using the highways of the Midwest to separate the places where victims lived from the places where they were eventually found. The man who would become associated with that pattern was Larry William Eyler, later known as the Highway Killer, or sometimes the Interstate Killer. Eyler would ultimately be sentenced to death for the murder of 16-year-old Daniel Bridges. But that conviction represented only a small part of a much larger and more complicated story. Investigators believed Eyler was connected to numerous other murders. Before his death in prison, he confessed to 21 additional killings, according to information later released by his attorney, Kathleen Zellner. Yet even that confession could not transform every suspicion into a legal fact. Some cases had never been prosecuted. Some victims had remained unidentified. And some accusations, including Eyler's allegations about another man, were never proven in court. The story of Larry Eyler is therefore not simply the story of a serial killer. It is also the story of victims whose lives were reduced, for a time, to missing person reports and unidentified remains. Investigators attempting to connect crimes across jurisdictions. Evidence that became entangled in constitutional questions. And families who continued searching for answers long after the man suspected of taking their loved ones was dead. To understand how that story began, it is necessary to look first at Eyler himself. Larry William Eyler was born on December 21st, 1952, in Crawfordsville, Indiana. The information available in the case describes his childhood as unstable. His family experienced serious difficulties, and his stepfathers were described as abusive. Those circumstances form part of Eyler's background, but they do not explain his later crimes, and they cannot excuse them. As an adult, Eyler lived and worked in different parts of Indiana. He was associated with gay communities in Indianapolis and Terre Haute. To people who knew him, he did not necessarily resemble the image of a future serial murderer. That apparent normality would become one of the disturbing features of the case. There was, however, an earlier incident that would later take on greater significance. In 1978, a young man named Craig Long survived an attack involving a knife. Eyler was arrested in connection with the incident and pleaded guilty to aggravated battery. He received a fine. At the time, the case did not expose the much larger pattern that would later emerge. But when investigators eventually reconstructed Eyler's history, the incident stood out as an earlier warning sign. For years later, in 1982, the pattern of killings began to become visible. One of the victims was 19-year-old Stephen Crockett. His body was discovered in Illinois on October 23, 1982. According to the supplied case information, Crockett had suffered multiple knife attacks. His death was not simply a tragedy for the people who knew him. It became one part of a sequence that investigators would eventually examine as a whole. Other names began entering the record. Delvoye Baker was only 14 years old. Robert Foley was another victim whose name became associated with the investigation. John Johnson was 25. Stephen Agon was 23. John Roach was 21. The ages were different, their individual lives were different, and the circumstances surrounding their disappearances and deaths were not identical. Yet a disturbing geographical feature connected many of the cases. The victims were found far from where they lived, often in isolated areas that could be reached from the highway network. At first, there was no simple answer to what that meant. A body found in a rural location does not, by itself, identify a killer. A victim discovered across a state line does not automatically connect one investigation to another. But as more young men disappeared and more bodies were recovered, the possibility of a larger pattern became increasingly difficult to ignore. On December 28, 1982, the body of 23-year-old Stephen Agon was found north of Newport, Indiana. Agon would later become one of the most important names in the Eyler investigation, not because his case immediately produced a definitive answer, but because years later Eyler would claim responsibility for his murder. Agon's case would also introduce another figure into the story, Robert David Little. Little had lived with Eyler and had a close relationship with him. According to Eyler's later statements, Little had participated in or assisted with some murders. Those allegations would eventually lead to a courtroom confrontation, but they remained allegations. In 1991, Eyler testified against Little in connection with Agon's murder. Eyler claimed that he and Little had participated together in the killing. The jury did not convict Little. The available information states that there was not enough independent physical evidence to substantiate Eyler's accusation. That distinction is essential. Eyler's statements became an important part of the historical record, but a statement made by a convicted murderer cannot simply be treated as proof of another person's guilt. The legal outcome was clear. Little was acquitted in the Agon case. The larger question, however, remained unresolved. What exactly did Robert Little know about Eyler's activities, and did he participate in any of them? The answer would remain one of the unanswered questions surrounding the highway killer. Investigation. Meanwhile, the number of victims associated with the broader investigation continued to grow. The names included David Block, Irvin Gibson, John Bartlett, Michael Bauer, Richard Wayne, Jay Reynolds, Gustavo Herrera, Jimmy Roberts, Daniel McNeve, Richard Bruce, John Brandenburg, Keith Bibbs, Ralph Calise, Eric Hansen, and eventually Daniel Bridges. But it is important not to flatten all of these cases into one category. Eiler was not convicted in court for every murder connected to his name. Some were investigative links. Others were crimes he later claimed responsibility for. The difference between suspicion, confession, and conviction would remain central to the case. And then, in September 1983, investigators came closer to Eiler than they ever had before. On September 30th, Indiana police stopped Eiler's vehicle on Interstate 65. They already suspected that he might be connected to the murders. During the detention and search, investigators obtained or examined objects they believed could be relevant, including Eiler's pickup truck, handcuffs, rope, and a knife containing traces of blood, along with other items. For investigators, this was a critical moment. They believed they might finally have evidence capable of connecting a suspect to a growing series of killings. But the case soon moved from the question of what the evidence might prove to a different question: whether police had obtained it lawfully. Eiler's attorney, David Shippers, challenged the legality of the detention and search. He argued that police had exceeded their authority by keeping Eiler too long and obtaining evidence without sufficient legal justification. After a lengthy hearing, Judge William Block determined that the continued detention after the initial traffic stop had been unlawful. Evidence obtained during that process was therefore affected by constitutional violations and could not be used as investigators had hoped. The consequence was devastating for the investigation. On February 6, 1984, Larry Eiler was released. The man investigators believed could be connected to a growing series of murders was once again free, in whatever answers the discarded evidence might have provided. They could no longer simply be placed before a jury. For the victims and their families, the investigation was not over. But for the authorities who had been trying to build a case, the path had suddenly become much more difficult. Eiler would soon move to Chicago. More bodies would be discovered. And before the year was over, the murder of a 16-year-old boy named Daniel Bridges would finally bring the investigation to a point from which there would be no easy return. By the time the first bodies connected to the emerging investigation were being discovered, there was no single scene that announced what was happening. There was no obvious boundary around the crimes, no single town that could claim the investigation as its own, and no immediate explanation for why young men were disappearing and later turning up dead far from the places where they had lived. Instead, there were individual cases, each carrying its own grief. There was 14-year-old Delvoyd Baker. There was 19-year-old Stephen Crockett. There was 25-year-old John Johnson. There was 23-year-old Stephen Agon. There was 21-year-old John Roach. There was also Robert Foley, whose name would later become part of the broader list connected to Larry Eiler. Their ages were different, their lives were different, and the circumstances of their deaths were not necessarily identical. What connected them was the growing geography of the investigation and the fact that their deaths increasingly appeared against a background of disappearances and bodies discovered and isolated locations across the Midwest. Stephen Crockett was one of the victims whose death helped establish the chronology. On October 23, 1982, his body was found in Illinois. Crockett was 19 years old. The available information states that he had suffered multiple knife attacks. That fact would become significant when investigators later examined the wider pattern surrounding Eiler. But at the time, the discovery had to be approached as its own homicide. For the people who knew Crockett, there was nothing abstract about the case. He had been 19 years old, and suddenly his life had been reduced to a crime scene, an investigation, and questions that others would have to answer. As additional victims appeared, the age of those involved became one of the most troubling aspects of the pattern. Delvoyd Baker was only 14. John Johnson was 25. Stephen Agon was 23. John Roach was 21. These were not identical victims in terms of age, but many were teenagers or young adults. Their names would eventually appear together in investigative files, even though their families had experienced their disappearances separately. That distinction matters. A serial murder investigation can create the impression that all victims somehow belong to one story from the beginning. They did not. Each family first knew only that one person was missing or dead. The larger connection came later, as investigators began placing separate cases side by side. One of the most important discoveries came on December 28, 1982, when the body of 23-year-old Stephen Agon was found north of Newport, Indiana. Agon's case would become particularly significant because of what Larry Eiler later claimed about it. Years after the murder, Eiler would say that he was responsible for Agon's death. But at the time of the discovery, investigators did not have the benefit of that later confession. They had a young man who was dead, a location in Indiana, and a growing series of cases that had not yet been conclusively tied together. Agon's name would later become central to another difficult question: the role of Robert David Little. Little had lived with Eiler and had a close relationship with him. According to Eiler's later statements, Little had participated in or assisted with some murders. Those statements would eventually become the basis for a prosecution, but they would not result in a conviction. In 1991, long after Agon's death, Eiler testified against Little. Eiler claimed that he and Little had participated together in Agon's murder, but the jury did not convict Little. The information available for this case emphasizes the reason. There was not enough independent physical evidence to substantiate Eiler's accusation. This distinction is critical when looking back at a case built partly around the statements of a convicted murderer. Eiler's words could provide investigators with leads and could change the direction of an investigation, but they did not automatically establish another person's guilt. The verdict in Little's case therefore left an unresolved question that has remained part of the broader history of the highway killer investigation. Meanwhile, other names continued to accumulate. Robert Foley became associated with the investigation. John Johnson, 25, became another victim in the sequence. John Roach, 21, was another. Later, the list would include David Block, Irving Gibson, John Bartlett, Michael Bauer, Richard Wayne, Jay Reynolds, Gustavo Herrera, Jimmy Roberts, Daniel McNeve, Richard Bruce, John Brandenburg, Keith Bibbs, Ralph Calise, Eric Hansen, and Daniel Bridges. But the list should not be mistaken for a list of crimes legally proven against Eiler. That is one of the most important distinctions in this entire story. Some cases were connected to Eiler through investigation. Some are cases that Eiler later confessed to, and only a limited number resulted in criminal convictions. The distinction between what investigators suspected, what Eiler claimed, and what a court actually established would remain essential long after his death. What investigators could see, however, was the geography. The bodies were frequently discovered away from the victims' homes. Some were found in rural or isolated places. Others were located near areas that could be reached from the extensive highway network crossing Indiana, Illinois, and neighboring states. That geography eventually contributed to the nickname that followed Eiler, the highway killer, and sometimes the interstate killer. The name was memorable, but the reality behind it was more complicated. Highways did not prove who committed a murder. A rural discovery did not automatically establish a connection. What mattered was the accumulation of cases. One death could be investigated alone. Two deaths could still be coincidence. But when the victims were repeatedly young men, when bodies were appearing in different jurisdictions, and when the locations shared the practical advantage of highway access. Investigators had to begin asking whether they were looking at the work of one person. The Midwest presented a particular challenge because the cases did not remain neatly within one police department's boundaries. Indiana and Illinois were central to the investigation, while the broader pattern extended into Wisconsin as well. A suspect who could travel across state lines could also create a fragmented investigative picture. One department might know one victim, another might know another. Information could exist in separate files without immediately revealing how the pieces fit together. That was the environment in which Eiler's name began to acquire significance. The earlier 1978 incident involving Craig Long provided another part of his history. Long had survived an attack involving a knife. Eiler had been arrested and pleaded guilty to aggravated battery, receiving a fine. On its own, that case did not establish the later murders. But when investigators eventually examined Eiler's background, it became a detail that could no longer be ignored. It was an earlier encounter between Eiler and the criminal justice system, years before the series of killings became apparent. Yet there was still a difference between suspicion and proof. The investigators needed evidence capable of linking Eiler to the murders, not simply a troubling history. That evidence would eventually become the central issue in September 1983. By then, the investigation had grown large enough for authorities to consider Eiler a significant suspect. The search for a connection was no longer theoretical. Police were beginning to focus directly on a particular man. On September 30th, 1983, Indiana police stopped Eiler's vehicle on Interstate 65. What followed would become one of the most consequential moments in the entire case. Investigators obtained or examined items they believed might connect Eiler to the murders, including his pickup truck, handcuffs, rope, and a knife containing traces of blood. Other objects were also considered potentially relevant. From the investigators' perspective, these discoveries represented the possibility of finally moving from a pattern of suspicion to evidence. But the case would soon turn on a different question, not simply what the evidence might mean, but whether the police had obtained it legally. Eiler's attorney, David Shippers, challenged the detention and search. The legal argument focused on the amount of time Eiler had been held and the authority police had to continue the detention and obtain evidence. The matter eventually reached Judge William Block. After a lengthy hearing, Block determined that the continued detention after the original traffic stop had been unlawful. Evidence obtained through that process was therefore affected by constitutional violations and could not be used in the way investigators had hoped. The significance of that decision cannot be separated from the victims whose cases remained unresolved. On February 6, 1984, Eiler was released. The suspect, whom investigators believed might be connected to multiple killings, was no longer in custody. Whatever the discarded evidence might have demonstrated, prosecutors could not simply put it before a jury. The investigation had suffered a major setback, and for the families whose loved ones were among the names in the growing list, the uncertainty continued. The case was moving toward its most critical phase, but it would take another victim before investigators could finally bring Eiler into court on a murder charge. That victim was 16-year-old Daniel Bridges. By the end of 1982, the investigation surrounding Larry Eiler was no longer a collection of completely separate deaths. The names were beginning to accumulate, and among them was 23-year-old Stephen Agon. His body was discovered on December 28, 1982, north of Newport, Indiana. At that moment, investigators did not have the full picture that would emerge years later. They did not yet have the confession that would eventually come from Eiler. They did not know how many other victims might ultimately be connected to the same suspect. And they certainly did not have the answers that Agon's family would eventually have to wait years. to hear. What they had was a young man who had been killed and a growing collection of cases involving other young victims across the Midwest. Agon's death would eventually become one of the most important pieces of the larger Eiler story, but not because it immediately produced a conviction. Instead, it would lead investigators toward another man and toward one of the most difficult questions in the entire case: whether Larry Eiler had acted alone. That man was Robert David Little. Little had lived with Eiler and had a close relationship with him. That connection alone did not establish criminal involvement, but it became significant when Eiler later claimed that Little had participated in or assisted with some of the murders. The allegation would transform the Agon case into something more complicated than a search for one killer. It raised the possibility of an accomplice, someone who might have known about Eiler's activities or even participated in them. But the story of Little has to be approached carefully, because the available evidence and the legal outcome do not support presenting his guilt as established fact. The central source of the accusation was Eiler himself, a man who would eventually be convicted of murder and sentenced to death. His statements could provide investigators with information, but they could not automatically become proof of another person's guilt. Years after Agon's death, the case returned to court. In 1991, Eiler testified against Robert David Little in connection with Agon's murder. Eiler claimed that he and Little had participated together in the killing. It was a serious accusation, and because it came from a man already associated with numerous murders, it carried obvious weight for investigators. But a courtroom requires more than suspicion and more than the word of a convicted killer. The jury did not convict Little. According to the information provided for this case, the prosecution did not have enough independent physical evidence to substantiate Eiler's accusation. The verdict therefore established an important boundary in the historical record. Eiler accused Little. Little denied the allegations. The jury did not find him guilty. That legal outcome must remain separate from the allegations themselves. It would be easy, especially when looking backward at a case involving a serial killer, to assume that everyone named by the killer must have been involved. But criminal investigations do not work that way. An accusation can generate a lead. It can direct investigators toward a new person, a new location, or a new possibility. It cannot, by itself, turn an allegation into a fact. The Agon case illustrates that distinction with unusual clarity. Eiler's later account became part of the record, but the court did not accept it as sufficient to convict Little. The question of Little's true role, therefore, remained unresolved. How much did he know? Did he witness anything? Did he assist Eiler in any crimes? Or was Eiler attempting to shift responsibility onto another person? The available information does not provide a definitive answer, and the responsible account is therefore to leave the question open. While the Agon investigation remained unresolved, the broader pattern continued to concern authorities. The names of other victims were already part of the developing picture. Delvoye Baker was only 14 years old. Stephen Crockett was 19. John Johnson was 25. John Roach was 21. Other names would later be associated with the same investigation, including Robert Foley, David Block, Irving Gibson, John Bartlett, Michael Bauer, Richard Wayne, Jay Reynolds, Gustavo Herrera, Jimmy Roberts, Daniel McNeve, Richard Bruce, John Brandenburg, Keith Bibbs, Ralph Calise, Eric Hansen, and eventually Daniel Bridges. The fact that these names appeared within the same investigative history did not mean that every murder had been legally established against Eiler. Some were cases investigators connected to him. Others were among the murders he later claimed responsibility for. Only a limited number resulted in convictions. That distinction would become especially important once Eiler's own statements began to shape the understanding of a case. For investigators in 1982 and 1983, however, there was another problem. The crimes crossed geographical boundaries. Indiana and Illinois were central to the investigation, while other cases extended into Wisconsin. A body discovered in one jurisdiction could be separated from another case by state lines, different police agencies, and different investigative files. Yet the highway network provided a possible geographical thread. Victims were being found in isolated places, often away from where they lived. The locations were accessible by roads and highways, allowing someone with a vehicle to move between areas without remaining tied to a single community. That pattern eventually contributed to the nickname Highway Killer. But the nickname itself did not solve anything. It was only a description of a pattern investigators were struggling to understand. The challenge was turning that pattern into evidence. By this point, Eiler had already come to the attention of law enforcement years earlier. In 1978, Craig Long survived an attack involving a knife, and Eiler had been arrested and pleaded guilty to aggravated battery. He received a fine. The incident did not expose a larger murder investigation at the time, but when investigators later reconstructed Eiler's background, it became an important part of the chronology. It showed that the criminal justice system had encountered him before the series of killings became visible. Still, the earlier conviction could not simply be used as proof that Eiler was responsible for later murders. It was a separate event, and the distinction between past wrongdoing and proof of a later homicide remained important. Investigators needed something more direct. They needed evidence connecting Eiler to the murders under investigation. That opportunity appeared on September 30th, 1983. Indiana police stopped Eiler's vehicle on Interstate 65. By then, authorities already suspected that he could be connected to the growing series of killings. The stop was therefore more than an ordinary encounter with a driver. Investigators were looking closely at a man they believed might hold answers to multiple cases. During the detention and search, authorities obtained or examined several items they considered potentially significant. These included Eiler's pickup truck, handcuffs, rope, and a knife containing traces of blood, along with other objects investigators believed might have connections to the murders. From the investigator's perspective, this was the kind of moment that could change the direction of a case. The murders had generated suspicion, but suspicion alone could not put Eiler in prison. Evidence might. The objects recovered during the encounter appeared to offer the possibility of a physical connection between Eiler and the crimes. But almost immediately, the investigation entered a different arena. The question became not simply what the evidence meant, but whether police had obtained it lawfully. Eiler's attorney, David Shippers, challenged the detention and search. The argument centered on the length of time Eiler had been held and whether police had exceeded their lawful authority. The case eventually came before Judge William Block. After a lengthy hearing, Block determined that the continued detention after the original traffic stop had been unlawful. The evidence obtained during that process was consequently affected by constitutional violations and could not be used as investigators had hoped. This decision became one of the defining turning points in the entire highway killer investigation. Investigators had spent months trying to connect separate deaths. They had developed a suspect. They had stopped him. They had obtained objects they believed might be important. And yet the legal process prevented those materials from becoming the foundation of a prosecution in the way authorities had wanted. On February 6, 1984, Larry Eiler was released. For the families of the victims, this was not simply a procedural development. Their loved ones were still dead. Many questions remained unanswered. And the person investigators suspected might be connected to the killings was no longer in custody. The release did not prove that Eiler had committed the murders, but it meant that the investigation had lost a crucial opportunity to act on evidence investigators believed could be important. The case was now entering a new phase. Eiler would move to Chicago. More victims would become associated with the investigation. And eventually, The murder of 16-year-old Daniel Bridges would provide investigators with a case that could finally bring Eiler into court. The tragedy of the September 1983 encounter was not that the law had failed to produce an immediate conviction. The constitutional protections at issue existed for a reason, and the court had to determine whether police had respected them. The tragedy was that the murder investigation remained unresolved while that legal battle unfolded. For the victims' families, there was no courtroom abstraction in the middle of their grief. There were simply unanswered questions and names that still needed explanations. Stephen Agon was one of those names. His case would remain linked to Eiler for years, eventually producing a confession and an attempted prosecution of Robert David Little. But even then, the courtroom could not provide every answer. Little was not convicted, and Eiler's accusation could not resolve the question of his involvement. The Agon case, therefore, became an example of how difficult it was to reconstruct a crime when the principal source of information was a convicted murderer whose own statements were impossible to treat as unquestionable truth. And as 1984 began, the investigation had reached another crossroads. Eiler was free. The evidence from the Interstate 65 encounter could not be used as investigators had hoped. The deaths remained unresolved, but the story was not over. In Chicago, another chapter was about to begin, and this time the victim would be 16-year-old Daniel Bridges. By September 1983, Larry Eiler was no longer simply a name in the background of a growing collection of murder investigations. Investigators had begun to regard him as a significant suspect in a series of killings involving young men across the Midwest. The cases stretched across Indiana and Illinois, with a broader pattern eventually reaching Wisconsin. Bodies had been found in isolated places, often far from where the victims lived, and the accessibility of those locations by highways contributed to the suspicion that the crimes might be connected. Yet suspicion was not enough. Investigators needed evidence that could establish a connection between Eiler and the murders in a courtroom. On September 30th, 1983, they came closer to obtaining that evidence. Indiana police stopped Eiler's vehicle on Interstate 65. The highway was already significant to the investigation because of the geographic pattern surrounding the killings. Now, Eiler himself was being stopped on one of those major routes. Authorities already suspected that he might be connected to the murders. The encounter, therefore, became one of the most consequential moments in the entire investigation. During the detention and subsequent search, police obtained or examined several items they believed might have connections to the killings. Among them were Eiler's pickup truck, handcuffs, rope, and a knife containing traces of blood. Other objects were also considered potentially relevant. To investigators, these items represented something that the investigation had desperately needed: the possibility of physical evidence linking a suspect to crimes that had otherwise remained difficult to connect. The significance of such evidence, however, depended on more than what the objects appeared to suggest. Before anything could become part of a criminal prosecution, investigators also had to establish that the evidence had been obtained through lawful procedures. That question soon became the center of the case. Eiler's attorney, David Shippers, challenged the legality of the police detention and search. The argument focused on what happened after the initial traffic stop. Shippers maintained that authorities had exceeded their lawful authority by holding Eiler for too long and obtaining evidence without sufficient legal justification. The issue was therefore no longer simply whether the objects recovered from Eiler might be connected to the murders. It was whether the government had followed the constitutional rules governing the detention and search of suspect. The distinction was crucial. Investigators could believe they were close to solving a series of murders, but a belief that someone was dangerous could not automatically eliminate constitutional protections. The court would have to determine whether police had acted within their legal authority. The matter eventually came before Judge William Block. After a lengthy hearing, Block concluded that the continued detention of Eiler after the original traffic stop had been unlawful. The ruling had a profound effect on the investigation. Evidence obtained during that process was affected by the constitutional violations identified by the court, meaning that investigators could not use those materials in the manner they had hoped. For a case already struggling to connect multiple murders across different jurisdictions, the consequence was severe. Investigators had found suspect. They had conducted a stop. They had obtained objects they believed could be important. But the legal foundation beneath that evidence had collapsed. The case demonstrated one of the most difficult realities of criminal investigation. Evidence is not useful simply because investigators believe it may prove something. It must also be obtained and preserved within the law. The constitutional protections that stood between the state and a suspect were not optional. Obstacles that could be ignored because the crimes under investigation were disturbing. The court's role was to determine whether the police had respected those limits. Judge Block's decision meant that the evidence from the encounter could not serve as the straightforward bridge between Eiler and the murders that investigators had wanted. And there was another consequence. Eiler was not going to remain in custody. On February 6, 1984, he was released. For the families of the victims, the date represented another chapter in a much longer period of uncertainty. Their loved ones were still dead. Their cases were still unresolved. And the man whom investigators believed might be connected to several killings was once again free. It is important not to turn this moment into a simplistic story in which one legal decision alone explains every later murder. The supplied information does not establish such a direct causal conclusion. What can be said is that the suppression of the evidence created a major setback for the investigation, and that Eiler's release meant authorities could no longer rely on those materials to pursue him in the way they had hoped. The investigation had to continue without the evidence that might have provided its strongest connection. The circumstances also demonstrate why the distinction between suspicion and proof mattered so much. In the Eiler case, investigators could have strong reasons to suspect him. They could see patterns among the victims. They could examine his history, including the 1978 aggravated battery conviction involving Craig Long. They could consider the objects recovered during the Interstate 65 encounter. But none of those things, standing alone, could substitute for admissible evidence sufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The legal system required more. And so, after February 6, 1984, Eiler returned to civilian life while the investigation continued. He moved to Chicago and eventually lived at 1628 West Sherwin Avenue. His partner at the time was John Dobrovolskis. The move was significant because Chicago would soon become the setting for the case that finally produced a murder conviction against Eiler. But before that happened, another victim would become associated with the broader investigation. On October 4, 1983, Eric Hansen, 18 years old, was found at Petrified Springs County Park in Wisconsin. His body was decomposed and missing several parts, making identification difficult. Hansen's case demonstrated how broad the geographical scope of the investigation had become. The deaths were not confined to one city or even one state. Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin were now part of the larger picture. The possibility of a killer moving through the Midwest made the investigation more difficult because information about one case could exist separately from information about another. Different jurisdictions had their own investigators and their own files. The victims' deaths had occurred in different locations, and the physical distance between cases could obscure their relationship. Yet the growing number of victims and the recurring geography continued to point investigators toward the possibility of a single offender. The nickname Highway Killer would later capture that pattern. But a nickname could not solve the underlying problem. Investigators still needed to prove individual crimes. The September 1983 encounter had shown how fragile an investigation could become when evidence was obtained improperly. The release of Eiler created another period in which authorities had to continue investigating, without the materials they had hoped would establish the connection. And somewhere beyond the legal arguments and investigative files were the families of the victims, waiting for information that could tell them what had happened to their loved ones. The uncertainty surrounding the murders was not an abstract problem. Every unresolved case represented a person whose family might still be asking the same basic questions. Where'd he go? Who was responsible? Why had his life ended? And would anyone ever be held accountable? Eiler's release did not answer any of those questions. Instead, it marked the beginning of another phase of the investigation. He was no longer simply a suspect who had been stopped and searched on an Indiana highway. He was a man living in Chicago while investigators continued trying to understand the larger pattern. The next major development would come not from the evidence suppressed after the Interstate 65 stop, but from a new crime that investigators could connect directly to Eiler. On August 21st, 1984, a janitor discovered bags containing human body parts in a garbage container near Eiler's Chicago apartment. The victim was identified as 16-year-old Daniel Bridges. This discovery would finally provide investigators with the case they needed. Unlike the earlier investigation, which had been undermined by the legality of the search and detention, the Bridges case created a direct connection between Eiler, his residence, physical evidence, and a victim. On August 21st, Eiler was arrested. 2 days later, on August 23rd, prosecutors formally charged him with murder and concealment of the body in connection with Bridges' death. The investigation that had struggled for years to convert suspicion into admissible evidence had finally reached a new stage. The question was no longer whether Eiler could be investigated. He was now facing a murder prosecution. But Daniel Bridges' death would also force authorities to confront the much larger question that had been hanging over the investigation since 1982. Was Bridges an isolated victim, or was his murder part of the same series that had already claimed so many young lives across the Midwest? The answer would eventually emerge through the prosecution of Eiler and, years later, through his own final statements. But first, the case would have to go to court. When Larry Eiler was released on February 6, 1984, the investigation had reached a frustrating point. Authorities had already developed serious suspicions about him, but the evidence obtained during the September 30th, 1983, encounter on Interstate 65 had been affected by constitutional violations. Judge William Block had determined that Eiler's continued detention after the initial traffic stop was unlawful, and the evidence obtained during that process could not be used in the way investigators had hoped. The man they suspected remained free. The murders remained unresolved, and the families of the victims still had no definitive answers. Eiler then moved to Chicago. He lived at 1628 West Sherwin Avenue, and his partner at the time was John Dobrovolskis. The move placed Eiler in a new city, but it did not erase the suspicion that had followed him from Indiana. By this point, investigators were attempting to understand a pattern that extended across several Midwestern jurisdictions. The victims were predominantly teenagers or young men, and their bodies had been discovered in isolated locations, often far from where they lived and in places accessible through the regional highway network. One of the victims associated with this broader investigation was 18-year-old Eric Hansen. On October 4th, 1983, Hansen was found at Petrified Springs County Park in Wisconsin. His body was decomposed and missing several parts, making identification difficult. His case illustrated the geographical complexity of the investigation. Indiana and Illinois were already central to the pattern, but now Wisconsin was also part of the broader picture. Investigators increasingly had reason to believe that they were not dealing with unrelated murders, occurring in separate jurisdictions. They were confronting a possible serial offender whose movements could cross state lines. Yet, even when investigators suspected a common offender, suspicion did not automatically provide a prosecutable case. Every murder still had to be established through evidence. Every connection had to withstand legal scrutiny. And the events of September 1983 had demonstrated how quickly an investigation could be weakened when evidence was obtained unlawfully. That was the environment in which Eiler remained free during 1984. Then, on August 21st, the investigation changed permanently. A janitor discovered bags containing human body parts in a garbage container near Eiler's Chicago apartment. The discovery was horrifying, but from an investigative standpoint, it also provided something the earlier cases had often lacked: a direct connection between a victim, a location associated with Eiler, and physical evidence that could be investigated without relying entirely on the evidence suppressed after the Interstate 65 stop. The victim was identified as 16-year-old Daniel Bridges. Bridges was one of the youngest victims associated with the case, and his age immediately underscored the human cost behind the growing investigation. He was not simply another name on a list. He was 16 years old, and his death would become the case that finally brought Eiler into court. Police focused on Eiler and arrested him on August 21st, 1984. 2 days later, on August 23rd, prosecutors formally charged him with murder and concealment of the body in connection with Bridges' death. The significance of the arrest went beyond the immediate charge. For nearly 2 years, investigators have been confronted by a series of deaths and disappearances that they increasingly believed might be connected. Eiler had already been investigated. He had already been stopped. Evidence had already been recovered and then placed beyond the reach of prosecutors because of constitutional violations. Now, however, investigators had another case. This time, the circumstances surrounding Daniel Bridges provided the foundation for a prosecution. The case could move forward. But the Bridges investigation also brought the larger question back into focus. If Eiler was responsible for Bridges' death, was he also responsible for the other young men whose bodies had appeared across the Midwest? Authorities already suspected a much larger pattern. Information from the period indicated that investigators had connected Eiler with approximately 21 murders in Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. That number was extraordinary, but it required careful interpretation. Being connected to a murder investigation did not mean that Eiler had been convicted of that murder. Some cases were investigative associations. Others would later become part of Eiler's own confession. Only a limited number were established through criminal convictions. The Bridges prosecution, therefore, became the central legal case against him, while the other murders remained part of a much broader investigative picture. This distinction would become increasingly important as the case progressed. A murder trial could not simply place every unsolved death before a jury and treat the entire collection as one crime. The prosecution had to establish the specific offense with which Eiler was charged. The death of Daniel Bridges gave prosecutors that opportunity. The case also marked a stark contrast with the September 1983 encounter. In that earlier episode, investigators had suspected Eiler and obtained objects they believed might be connected to the murders, including his pickup truck, handcuffs, rope, and a knife with traces of blood. But the legality of the detention and search undermined the use of those materials. With Bridges, investigators had a different path. The discovery of human remains near Eiler's apartment created a direct investigative link that did not depend upon simply resurrecting the evidence that had already been excluded. The legal process could now proceed. Eiler was eventually convicted of murdering Daniel Bridges and sentenced to death. The Illinois courts later upheld the sentence during the appeals process. For the prosecution, this was the moment when suspicion became a formal judgment. For the families of other victims, however, the conviction could not provide complete closure. Daniel Bridges had a conviction attached to his name. Many other victims did not. The distinction was painful but necessary. A person could be connected to an investigation without the evidence required for a conviction. Eiler could be suspected of multiple murders, and he could later confess to them. But the legal record still depended upon what prosecutors could prove. That difference would define the final chapter of the case. By the time Eiler received his death sentence, investigators had reason to believe that the Bridges murder was only one part of something much larger. The names already associated with the investigation included Stephen Crockett, Delvoyd Baker, John Johnson, Stephen Agon, John Roach, Robert Foley, David Block, Irvin Gibson, John Bartlett, Michael Bauer, Richard Wayne, Jay Reynolds, Gustavo Herrera, Jimmy Roberts, Daniel McNeve, Richard Bruce, John Brandenburg, Keith Bibbs, Ralph Calise, Eric Hansen, and Daniel Bridges. But the list was not a list of 21 courtroom convictions. It was the outline of an investigative mystery that extended far beyond the one crime for which Eiler had been sentenced to die. There was also the unresolved question of Robert David Little. Eiler had eventually accused Little of participating in the murder of Stephen Agon and other killings. In 1991, Eiler testified against him, but Little was not convicted. The jury did not accept the evidence as sufficient to establish his guilt, and Eiler's allegations remained allegations rather than a judicial determination that Little had participated in the murders. The case, therefore, contained several different layers of truth. There was what investigators suspected. There was what prosecutors could prove. There was what courts accepted. And finally, there was what Larry Eiler himself claimed. Those categories would not always overlap. The conviction for Daniel Bridges established one part of the story. It did not automatically establish the rest. That was why the case did not truly end with Eiler's conviction. Even after the death sentence, investigators and families were still left with questions about the other victims. Some of those questions would remain unanswered for years. Others would receive partial answers only after Eiler began providing information about additional murders. Before his death, he would reportedly confess to 21 other killings. Those statements would become one of the most consequential developments in the entire case. But they would also create a new problem. How should investigators, historians, and families evaluate the words of a convicted murderer? Eiler's confession could reveal information that only the killer might know. It could potentially help identify victims and clarify circumstances that had remained mysterious. But a confession was not the same thing as a courtroom conviction. Some of his claims could be checked against existing evidence. Others could remain difficult to independently verify. The tragedy was that many families had to rely on information from a man who had already taken their loved ones from them. Daniel Bridges' case had finally brought Eiler to justice for one murder. But the larger investigation was only beginning to reveal its full scope. The man sitting behind bars was no longer simply a suspect in a series of Midwestern killings. He was a convicted murderer facing the death penalty. While investigators continued examining whether his name belonged beside the names of many more victims. And somewhere within that growing list were people whose identities were still unknown. Their stories would eventually become one of the most important parts of what remained after Larry Eiler was gone. The conviction for Daniel Bridges gave the justice system one definitive answer. Larry Eiler had been held legally responsible for the murder of a 16-year-old boy. He had been sentenced to death, and the Illinois courts later upheld that sentence during the appeals process. But for investigators and for the families of the other victims, the conviction did not close the case. In many ways, it created an even more difficult question. If Eiler was responsible for Daniel Bridges, how many of the other deaths that had accumulated across Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and the wider Midwest could be connected to him? By the time Eiler was behind bars, authorities had already associated his name with a much larger group of killings. The names included Stephen Crockett, Delvoyd Baker, Robert Foley, John Johnson, Stephen Agon, John Roach, David Block, Irving Gibson, John Bartlett, Michael Bauer, Richard Wayne, Jay Reynolds, Gustavo Herrera, Jimmy Roberts, Daniel McNeve, Richard Bruce, John Brandenburg, Keith Bibbs, Ralph Calise, Eric Hansen, and Daniel Bridges. But there was an important difference between that investigative list and a list of convictions. Eiler had not been tried and convicted for every one of those deaths. Some were cases investigators believed were connected to him. Others would later become part of Eiler's own statements. And some victims remained unidentified for decades. The distinction mattered because the case had always contained several different layers of information. There were the crimes themselves, the evidence collected by investigators, the theories developed across multiple jurisdictions, the cases that could be taken to court, and finally the statements made by Eiler himself. None of those categories could simply be treated as interchangeable. As the years passed, Eiler became increasingly important as a source of information about the unresolved cases. The man who had once been the subject of an investigation was now a convicted murderer with knowledge that investigators believed might explain other deaths. That created an extraordinary and uncomfortable situation. Families who had spent years waiting for answers could potentially receive information from the person suspected of having caused their loss. But any such information had to be treated carefully. A confession could provide leads, identify locations, explain circumstances, or help investigators determine whether an unidentified victim belonged to the larger pattern. At the same time, Eiler's statements were not automatically equivalent to independent proof. He was a convicted killer, and his claims had to be separated from facts that could be independently established. This became especially important when Eiler began speaking about murders beyond the Bridges case. Before his death, Eiler confessed to 21 additional killings. According to his attorney, Kathleen Zellner, the confession included information about the circumstances surrounding numerous murders. Some of the victims were already known to investigators. Others had remained unidentified. 7 people in the list were still without names at the time the confession was made public. For families who had spent years without knowing what happened to their loved ones, this information had enormous significance. A missing person could remain suspended between hope and grief for years. A family might know that something terrible had probably happened, but without a body, a name, or an explanation, there was no definitive ending. Eiler's statements offered the possibility of changing that, but they also forced investigators to confront the difficult problem of verification. The confession had to be examined against what was already known about each case. Eiler described a pattern in which he approached victims and, according to the information released by Zellner, sometimes used offers involving alcohol, drugs, or money before taking them to isolated locations. He described methods of controlling victims that included restraints such as handcuffs, ropes, or other means of physical restraint. These details were disturbing, but the significance of the confession was not in its ability to create a dramatic image of the crimes. Its importance was that it potentially connected an individual to cases that had previously existed as separate mysteries. The information also suggested that the killings were not all identical in their circumstances. Some cases involved victims who had been discovered far from their homes. Some had remained unidentified. Some were already connected to Eiler through investigative work. The confession, therefore, became another piece in an already complicated puzzle. Among the cases was Stephen Agon. Eiler had previously claimed that he was responsible for Agon's death and had gone further by, accusing Robert David Little of participating with him. That accusation had eventually led to Eiler testifying against Little in 1991. But the jury did not convict Little. The lack of sufficient independent physical evidence meant that Eiler's allegations did not result in a guilty verdict. The Agon case therefore demonstrated both the usefulness and the limitations of Eiler's statements. His words could reopen questions and direct investigators toward possible accomplices, but they could not guarantee a conviction. Little's acquittal remained the legal outcome. Eiler's allegations about him remained allegations. The same caution had to be applied when considering the larger list of murders. The number 21 became one of the most striking figures associated with the highway killer case. But it could not simply be translated into 21 convictions. Eiler was not convicted in 21 additional murder trials. His confession was a statement of responsibility, not a series of courtroom verdicts. That difference is particularly important in a case where the suspect himself had become one of the principal sources of information about crimes that authorities had struggled to solve. It was also possible that the confession could provide answers that were otherwise inaccessible. Some victims have been known only through unidentified remains. One of the most important examples involved a young man eventually identified as Keith Lavelle Bibbs. Bibbs had been 17 when he was killed. His remains had been discovered in Indiana in 1983, but for approximately 40 years. Investigators did not know his identity. For decades, he was known by the placeholder name Adam Doe. His identity was finally established in 2023 through DNA and forensic genetic techniques. That development occurred long after Eiler's death, but it demonstrated that the work of identifying victims could continue for decades. A name restored to an unidentified victim is more than a forensic result. It restores part of the person's identity to the historical record. It allows the victim to be remembered as an individual rather than simply as an unidentified body, connected to a serial murder investigation. Keith Bibbs was 17 years old when his life ended. The fact that it took decades to establish his name illustrates how much remained unresolved even after Eiler's conviction and eventual death. The same broader problem affected other cases. Some victims had names, but their families still lacked a complete explanation of what happened. Others had been linked to Eiler only through his statements or investigative conclusions. And in some cases, the available information did not allow authorities to establish every detail with certainty. The passage of time made that work even more difficult. Witness memories could fade. Physical evidence could deteriorate or disappear. Investigative records could remain incomplete. And the principal suspect himself would eventually be gone. Eiler's death came on March 6, 1994. He died in prison from complications related to AIDS, before the death sentence against him could be carried out. His death ended the possibility of another trial in which he might have faced additional charges. It also meant that any further information about the murders could only come from what he had already said. There would be no future courtroom confrontation in which prosecutors could question him about every accusation. There would be no opportunity to compel him to answer new questions about cases that remained unresolved. His death, therefore, closed one door while leaving many others open. For families, the most difficult part may have been that a conviction for Daniel Bridges did not mean that every question surrounding the other victims had been answered. The broader list of names remained. Some had become associated with Eiler through investigative evidence. Some were among the 21 killings he confessed to. Some questions surrounding Robert David Little remained unresolved. And some victims, including people whose identities had not yet been discovered, remained unknown. The case therefore became a long-term investigation rather than a story with a clean ending. Eiler was dead, but the process of identifying victims and determining what could be established about their deaths continued. His confession had opened a door into the past, but did not eliminate uncertainty. That uncertainty is especially important when considering the number of victims attributed to Eiler. It will be tempting to reduce the story to a single statistic and move on. But behind every number was an individual. Stephen Crockett was 19. Delvoyd Baker was 14. Stephen Agon was 23. John Roach was 21. Eric Hansen was 18. Daniel Bridges was 16. Keith Bibbs was 17. Their ages remind us that the investigation was not simply about a criminal record. It was about young lives interrupted and families left to confront the consequences. Eiler's confession could never restore those lives. At best, it could help answer questions that had remained unanswered. And even then, the answers had to be approached with caution. The final chapter of the case would therefore not be about the killer alone. It would be about what remained after him, the victims, the families, the unidentified dead. The investigators who continued examining old cases, and the difficult distinction between what was confessed, what was suspected, and what could actually be proven. Larry Eiler had entered prison as a convicted murderer. He died there in 1994. But the investigation into the lives and deaths connected to his name continued long after the prison doors had closed behind him. Larry Eiler was already a convicted murderer when the final and most extraordinary chapter of the investigation began to take shape. The conviction for the murder of 16-year-old Daniel Bridges had established Eiler's responsibility for one killing. He had received a death sentence, and the Illinois courts later upheld that sentence through the appeals process. But the Bridges conviction represented only a fraction of the cases that investigators had associated with his name. For years, authorities had been examining a larger group of deaths involving teenagers and young men across Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and other parts of the Midwest. Now Eiler was in prison, facing the prospect of execution, and he possessed something investigators had spent years trying to obtain: information about what had happened to other victims. Before his death, Eiler confessed to 21 additional murders. The confession would become one of the most important sources of information in the entire investigation. But it would also create a difficult problem. How much of what Eiler said could be established independently? Which statements explained previously mysterious cases, and which remained only claims made by a convicted murderer? Those questions would never completely disappear. Eiler's attorney, Kathleen Zellner, later released information about his confessions. According to the material provided for this case, Eiler described 21 additional killings and gave investigators information about the circumstances surrounding them. The revelations were significant because some of the victims had already been associated with the broader investigation, while others had remained unidentified. At the time the confession became public, 7 people included in the list still did not have names. For families who had spent years waiting for answers, this distinction between a name and an unidentified body was profound. A person who disappeared could remain a question rather than a confirmed death. A family might suspect that something terrible had happened, but without identification, there could be no certainty. Eiler's statements offered the possibility of closing some of those gaps, but they also required caution. A confession is not automatically proof of every detail contained within it. Eiler had already been convicted of murder, and he had a clear place in the history of the case. His statements could be checked against known evidence, locations, victim information, and existing investigative records. Where those independent pieces of information supported his claims, investigators could gain confidence. Where they did not, the claims remained difficult to verify. This was especially important because the number 21 could easily be misunderstood. Eiler's confession to 21 additional killings did not mean that he had received 21 additional murder convictions. He had not. His legal conviction remained based on a limited number of crimes. Most importantly, the murder of Daniel Bridges. The other cases existed at different levels of investigative certainty. Some were linked to Eiler through evidence or investigative work. Some were included in his confession. Others remained unresolved. That distinction is central to understanding the case accurately. Eiler's statements, nevertheless, provided a disturbing picture of how he said he approached some victims. According to information released by Zellner, he described approaching victims with offers involving alcohol, drugs, or money and then taking them to isolated locations. He described methods of physical control, including the use of restraints such as handcuffs and ropes. These details were not important merely because they were shocking. They were potentially useful because they offered investigators a possible behavioral pattern that could be compared with unsolved cases. A case that had once seemed unrelated might acquire new significance if its circumstances matched information Eiler had provided. A victim whose identity had been unknown might potentially be connected to a person previously reported missing. A location might fit a description given by Eiler. A previously unexplained detail might suddenly have context, but every comparison required caution. A matching pattern could provide a lead without independently proving that Eiler had committed the crime. This problem was particularly visible in the case of Stephen Agon and Robert David Little. Eiler had claimed that he and Little had participated together in Agon's murder. In 1991, Eiler testified against Little. The accusation was serious, but the jury did not convict him. The available information states that there was insufficient independent physical evidence to confirm Eiler's allegations. Little was acquitted. That result remained an important reminder that Eiler's words, no matter how detailed, could not automatically establish another person's guilt. The same principle had to be applied to the larger confession. Eiler could provide information, but investigators still had to distinguish between what he claimed and what could be demonstrated independently. The confession also brought attention to victims whose names had been lost. Among the most significant was a young man eventually identified as Keith Lavelle Bibbs. Bibbs was 17 years old when he was killed. His remains had been discovered in Indiana in 1983, but for approximately 4 decades. Investigators did not know who he was. He was known by the placeholder name Adam Doe. For 40 years, the victim existed in the records without the identity that belonged to him in life. Then, in 2023, DNA and forensic genetic techniques finally established his identity as Keith Lavelle Bibbs. The development was extraordinary because it demonstrated that the investigation did not end with Eiler's death. He died in 1994, but the work of identifying his victims continued into the 21st century. The identification of Bibbs was not simply a technical achievement. It restored a name to someone who had been known for decades only through an anonymous designation. He had been 17 years old. He had a family, a history, and an identity that existed long before his remains were given the label Adam Doe. His identification changed the record and allowed him to be remembered as an individual rather than only as an unidentified victim in a serial murder investigation. Yet Bibbs was only one example of the unanswered questions left behind. The broader list of victims included Stephen Crockett, Delvoyd Baker, Robert Foley, John Johnson, Stephen Agon, John Roach, David Block, Irving Gibson, John Bartlett, Michael Bauer, Richard Wayne, Jay Reynolds, Gustavo Herrera, Jimmy Roberts, Daniel McNeve, Richard Bruce, John Brandenburg, Ralph Calise, Eric Hansen, Daniel Bridges, and others associated with Eiler's confessions and investigative history. Each name represented a separate life. Each case had its own circumstances, its own family, and its own unanswered questions. Reducing them to a single number risked obscuring that reality. The investigation also left a difficult question concerning the exact scale of Eiler's crimes. Authorities had linked him to approximately 21 murders in Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin, while Eiler himself confessed to 21 additional killings before his death. The numbers could overlap with cases already associated with him, and the legal status of individual cases varied. Therefore, it would be inaccurate to present the entire collection as a simple list of murders proven in court. The more precise conclusion is that Eiler was convicted of specific murders, while investigators and his own later statements connected him to a much larger group of deaths. That difference became even more important after his death. On March 6, 1994, Eiler died in prison from complications related to AIDS. He died before his death sentence could be carried out. His death removed the possibility of another trial in which prosecutors might have confronted him with additional charges. It also meant that investigators could no longer question him directly about newly discovered evidence or unresolved cases. Whatever information he had chosen to reveal before his death was all that remained. For some families, those revelations may have provided a measure of clarity. For others, the answers remained incomplete. And for some victims, even a name was still missing. The passage of time would eventually bring new forensic methods into the investigation. DNA analysis and forensic genetic genealogy could accomplish things that investigators in the 1980s had not possessed the technology to do. Keith Bibb's identification in 2023 demonstrated how an old case could suddenly move forward decades. Later, a body once described only through an unidentified person designation could finally be connected to a real human being. But even when a victim was identified, identification did not necessarily answer every question surrounding the death. It could tell investigators who the person was without providing every detail of how the crime occurred or precisely who was responsible. Eiler's confession could offer one possible answer, but again, his statements had to be evaluated carefully. That is perhaps the most complicated legacy of the final confessions. They were neither meaningless nor absolute. They could not simply be dismissed because Eiler was a convicted murderer, nor could every statement be accepted without verification. They were pieces of information in an investigation that had already demonstrated how difficult it could be to establish the truth. The case had begun with separate disappearances and deaths. It had developed into a multi-state investigation. Eiler had once been stopped on an Indiana highway, only for crucial evidence from that encounter to be suppressed. He had later been arrested and convicted for Daniel Bridges' murder. Then, from prison, he became a source of information about additional killings. After his death, investigators continued working to identify victims. The story therefore moved in an unusual direction, even after the killer was gone. The investigation continued to grow. And perhaps that is the most important point to remember. The final chapter of Larry Eiler's life was not really about Larry Eiler. It was about the people whose lives had been interrupted and whose identities had been reduced to case numbers, unidentified remains, or names on an investigative list. The confessions could not return those lives. They could not erase the grief experienced by families. But in some cases, they helped open a path toward answers. And decades later, the identification of victims, such as Keith Bibb's, showed that the search for those answers could continue long after the person responsible was no longer alive to face them. By the time Larry Eiler died on March 6, 1994, the criminal case against him had reached its legal conclusion, but the larger investigation had not. Eiler had been convicted of murdering 16-year-old Daniel Bridges and sentenced to death. The sentence had been upheld through the Illinois appeals process. Yet Eiler died in prison from complications related to AIDS before the state could carry out the execution. His death removed the possibility of another trial, another interrogation under courtroom conditions, or another opportunity for investigators to question him directly about the many other deaths associated with his name. But it did not erase those cases. It did not return the victims to their families. And it did not provide a simple answer to every question that had accumulated since the first bodies began appearing in the Midwest in 1982. In the years after his death, Larry Eiler's name remained connected to a much larger collection of murders than the cases for which he had actually been convicted. That distinction is essential. Eiler was legally convicted in a limited number of cases, most importantly, the murder of Daniel Bridges. At the same time, investigators had connected him to numerous other killings. And before his death, he confessed to 21 additional murders. Those confessions became an important part of the historical record, but they did not transform every case into a courtroom conviction. The difference between a confession and a verdict remains central to understanding what could and could not be established. It is easy to look at a case like this decades later and compress everything into a single number. But the number of victims associated with Eiler tells only part of the story. Behind every case was a person who had been living a life before disappearing. Delvoye Baker was 14. Stephen Crockett was 19. Stephen Agon was 23. John Johnson was 25. John Roach was 21. Eric Hansen was 18. Daniel Bridges was 16. Keith Bibbs was 17. Their ages alone make clear how many of those affected were teenagers or young adults. Yet the victims should not be remembered only through the circumstances of their deaths. Their identities existed before they became names in investigative files. The tragedy of the highway killer case is that for some families, the disappearance of a loved one was followed by years in which even the most basic questions remained unanswered. A body might be recovered without an identity. A name might be known without a complete explanation of what had happened. A suspected offender might be identified without enough evidence to secure conviction. And even when a conviction was obtained, it could account for only one victim while leaving dozens of other questions unresolved. That was one of the most painful characteristics of the investigation. The legal system could provide an answer to one specific crime, but it could not automatically provide answers for every other death connected to the same suspect. The Daniel Bridges conviction, therefore, represented both justice and limitation. It established that Eiler was responsible for Bridges' murder. It provided a legal judgment for the family of one 16-year-old victim. But it could not, by itself, establish the circumstances surrounding Stephen Crockett's death, Stephen Agon's death, Eric Hansen's death, or the other cases associated with Eiler. Those cases require their own evidence. Some would remain linked to Eiler through investigative work. Others would become associated with him because of his own later statements. And some would continue to resist complete resolution. One of the most complicated, unresolved issues concerned Robert David Little. Eiler had accused Little of participating in some murders, including the killing of Stephen Agon. In 1991, Eiler testified against him, but Little was not convicted. The jury did not find the evidence sufficient to establish his guilt, and the available information specifically notes the absence of enough independent physical evidence to support Eiler's accusation. That outcome matters because it demonstrates why Eiler's statements had to be handled carefully. A convicted murderer could provide information, but that did not mean every accusation he made was true. The legal system had to distinguish between a statement that generated a lead and evidence capable of proving guilt. Little's acquittal, therefore, remained the legal answer to that particular prosecution, regardless of the questions that Eiler's allegations continued to raise. The same caution applied to Eiler's final confession. According to information released by his attorney, Kathleen Zellner, Eiler confessed to 21 additional murders before his death. The confession contained information about victims, locations, and circumstances that could potentially help investigators understand cases that had remained unresolved. Some of the victims were already known. Others were still unidentified. 7 people in the list remained without names at the time the confession was made public. The confession, therefore, had the potential to do something that the criminal trial could not. Help investigators reconstruct a broader picture of what may have happened to people whose cases had never reached a courtroom. Yet even then, the confession had limitations. Eiler was no longer alive to be questioned after March 1994. His statements could not be tested through a new prosecution against him. Investigators could compare them with existing evidence. But where independent confirmation was unavailable, the confession remained a claim made by the person who said he had committed the crimes. That uncertainty would become especially significant as technology changed. In the 1980s, investigators had struggled to identify some victims. In the decades that followed, advances in DNA analysis and forensic genetic techniques created possibilities that had not existed when the bodies were first discovered. One of the clearest examples was Keith Lavelle Bibbs. Bibbs had been 17 when he was killed. His remains were discovered in Indiana in 1983, but his identity remained unknown for approximately 40 years. For decades, he was known as Adam Doe. The name was not really a name at all. It was a placeholder, a way for the investigative system to refer to a person whose true identity had been lost. Then in 2023, DNA and forensic genetic techniques identified him as Keith Lavelle Bibbs. The discovery came nearly 3 decades after Eiler's death. That timing is significant. It demonstrated that an investigation can continue even after the person suspected of causing the death is gone. Identifying Bibbs did not bring back the 17-year-old whose life had ended in 1983, but it restored something fundamental: his name. For his family and for the historical record, he was no longer simply Adam Doe. He was Keith Lavelle Bibbs, a 17-year-old whose life had existed independently of the investigation that eventually surrounded his death. His identification also illustrated the long-term consequences of unresolved homicide cases. A case does not necessarily end when a suspect is convicted or dies. Families may continue searching for answers. Investigators may continue examining old evidence. New forensic technology may reopen questions that once seemed impossible to answer. And an unidentified victim may remain unidentified for decades before science finally provides a path forward. The highway killer investigation, therefore, became larger than Larry Eiler himself. His death ended his ability to speak, but it did not end the responsibility to remember those who had died. The remaining work belonged to investigators, forensic specialists, families, and anyone attempting to reconstruct the truth from incomplete evidence. The case also offers a difficult lesson about the relationship between law enforcement and constitutional protections. In 1983, investigators believed they had found important evidence after stopping Eiler on Interstate 65. But Judge William Block determined that his continued detention after the original traffic stop was unlawful, and the evidence obtained through that process was affected by constitutional violations. Eiler was released on February 6, 1984. It is impossible to know with certainty what would have happened if that evidence had been admissible. It would be speculation to claim that every later murder could have been prevented. What can be established is that the ruling represented a major setback for investigators and that Eiler remained free until his arrest in connection with Daniel Bridges. That history creates one of the most painful questions in the case: whether an earlier successful prosecution might have prevented later deaths. There is no definitive answer. What remains is the knowledge that investigators had already identified Eiler as a significant suspect. Yet the legal problems surrounding the evidence prevented them from moving forward in the way they had hoped. That tension between investigative urgency and constitutional safeguards is not unique to the Eiler case. But here it became especially consequential because of the number of unresolved killings surrounding him. Ultimately, the story of Larry Eiler should not end with the image of the killer receiving a death sentence or dying in prison. The more important ending belongs to the victims. Their names deserve to stand independently from the man who became infamous because of their deaths. Stephen Crockett was not merely a name in a serial killer list. Delvoye Baker was not merely a 14-year-old victim. Stephen Agon was not merely evidence in a later prosecution. Daniel Bridges was not simply the case that finally sent Eiler to death row. Keith Bibbs was not Adam Doe. These were people whose lives existed before the investigation and whose identities deserved to survive it. Eiler's crimes created a legacy of fear and unanswered questions. But the continuing investigation also created another legacy: the determination to identify the dead and restore their names. More than 30 years after Eiler's death, that work was still capable of producing answers. The identification of Keith Bibbs in 2023 was proof that time does not necessarily have the final. We're in a cold case. Technology can change. Records can be revisited. Old evidence can acquire new meaning. Families can finally learn the name of someone they lost decades earlier. That does not erase the tragedy, but it can restore a measure of dignity to the victim. In the end, the highway killer case remains a story of what was known, what was suspected, what was confessed, and what could actually be proven. Eiler was convicted of specific murders, including the killing of Daniel Bridges. He later confessed to 21 additional killings. Investigators associated his name with a much broader series of deaths across the Midwest. Yet not every case received a courtroom verdict, and not every question was answered. Some victims remained unidentified for decades. Some accusations against other people never resulted in convictions. And some mysteries survived the death of the man at the center of them. That is why the story of Larry Eiler cannot be measured only by the sentence imposed upon him. The more lasting measure is the lives of the victims and the years spent trying to recover their stories. Larry Eiler died in 1994. The investigation did not, for the families still seeking answers. The case was never simply about how many people a murderer may have killed. It was about who those people were, where they came from, and whether their names would ever be spoken again. In some cases, the answers came through confession. In others, through investigation. And in at least one extraordinary case, nearly 40 years later, through DNA and forensic science. The final legacy is therefore not Larry Eiler's notoriety. It is the continuing effort to remember the people who should never have been reduced to numbers in the first place. By the time Larry Eiler died in prison in 1994, his name had become associated with a long and disturbing list of deaths across the Midwest. But a list of names can create distance. It can make a series of human tragedies look like a collection of entries in a police file: victim, age, date, location. The reality was very different. Each name represented a person who had a life before becoming part of the investigation. Each disappearance left someone waiting for answers. Each unidentified body left a family, or perhaps an entire community, without the certainty that comes with knowing what happened. That is why the victims must remain at the center of the story. The investigation into Larry Eiler began to take shape around deaths that appeared increasingly difficult to explain as isolated events. Young people disappeared or were found dead in Indiana and Illinois, and eventually cases in Wisconsin became part of the larger picture. The bodies were often discovered in rural or isolated areas, many of them accessible through the regional highway system. This geography eventually contributed to the nickname Highway Killer. But the roads themselves were only part of the story. The more important pattern was the repeated loss of young lives and the growing suspicion that the same offender might be responsible for more than one death. Among the victims was 14-year-old Delvoyd Baker. His age is one of the starkest reminders of the vulnerability of some of the young people caught within the investigation. Baker was not an adult whose disappearance could be explained away by assumptions about independence or lifestyle. He was 14. His inclusion in a larger Eiler investigation means that the story cannot be reduced to a confrontation between police and a suspected murderer. There were families on the other side of every investigation, families who had to live with the disappearance or death of someone they loved. Stephen Crockett was 19 when he was killed. His body was discovered in Illinois on October 23, 1982, and records associated with the case indicated that he had suffered multiple knife wounds. Crockett's death became one of the early cases associated with the emerging pattern. At that point, the investigation did not yet have the full shape it would eventually acquire. There was no final list of victims and no certainty that a single killer was responsible. There were only individual deaths and investigators trying to determine whether the cases belonged together. Stephen Agon was 23 when his body was found on December 28, 1982, north of Newport, Indiana. Agon's case later became particularly important because Eiler himself claimed responsibility for his death. He also claimed that Robert David Little had participated with him. That accusation led to a later prosecution in which Eiler testified against Little in 1991. But the jury did not convict Little. The available evidence was insufficient to establish his guilt. And the case remains an important reminder that an allegation made by Eiler could not simply be treated as established fact. Agon, therefore, occupies a complicated place in the history of the investigation. His death became connected to Eiler through the investigation and through Eiler's own statements, while the accusation against another person failed to produce a conviction. John Roach was 21. John Johnson was 25. Robert Foley was another name associated with a broader group of victims. David Block, Irvin Gibson, John Bartlett, Michael Bauer, Jay Reynolds, Gustavo Herrera, Jimmy Roberts, Daniel McNeve, Richard Bruce, John Brandenburg, Richard Wayne, and others were also included in the larger investigative history. Their names remind us of the geographical and chronological scale of the case. These were not all people from the same neighborhood or victims from a single incident. The cases extended across jurisdictions, which made the investigation more complicated and made it more difficult for authorities to immediately recognize the full pattern. That geographical spread also helps explain why the highway network became so important to the investigation. A person traveling through several states could encounter victims in different jurisdictions, leaving investigators with separate cases that might not initially appear connected. A body discovered in one state could be investigated by one department while a missing person report existed somewhere else. Information that might have revealed a connection could remain separated by jurisdictional boundaries. The investigation into Eiler eventually demonstrated the importance of looking beyond individual cases and considering whether apparently unrelated deaths shared a common offender. Eric Hansen was 18 when his body was found on October 4, 1983, at Petrified Springs County Park in Wisconsin. His remains were decomposed and missing several parts, which complicated identification. Hansen's case is important because it expanded the geographical dimension of the investigation. Indiana and Illinois were already central to the emerging pattern, but Wisconsin became another location in which a victim was associated with a broader series. The discovery also illustrated a recurring problem in homicide investigations. Sometimes the first challenge is not determining who committed a crime, but determining who the victim was. Without a name, investigators have fewer opportunities to connect the dead person to a missing person report, family, friends, employment, or other records. Identification is therefore not merely administrative. It is often the first step toward reconstructing a person's final movements and understanding what happened. Daniel Bridges was 16 years old when he became the victim whose murder finally brought Eiler to a successful prosecution. On August 21, 1984, a janitor discovered bags containing human body parts in a garbage container near Eiler's Chicago apartment. The victim was identified as Bridges. Eiler was arrested that same day, and 2 days later prosecutors formally charged him with murder and concealment of the body. Bridges' case became the foundation for the conviction that resulted in Eiler receiving a death sentence. His case was therefore different from many of the others associated with Eiler. The evidence allowed prosecutors to establish his guilt in court. Yet even that conviction could not answer every question about the other victims. Daniel Bridges was not simply the case that ended the investigation. His death was also one of the final links in a pattern that investigators believed extended much further. Then there was Keith Lovell Bibbs. Bibbs was 17 years old when he was killed, and his remains were discovered in Indiana in 1983. For approximately 40 years, however, investigators did not know his identity. He became known as Adam Doe, a designation used because his real name was unknown. For decades, his family and investigators could not connect his remains to the identity of Keith Lovell Bibbs. In 2023, DNA and forensic genetic techniques finally changed that. Bibbs was identified after approximately 4 decades. The discovery came nearly 30 years after Eiler's death, proving that the passage of time did not necessarily mean that an unidentified victim would remain unidentified forever. Modern forensic technology could reopen a question that investigators in the 1980s had been unable to answer. Bibbs' identification also illustrates why the language used to describe unidentified victims matters. Adam Doe was never the person's true identity. It was a temporary label for a human being whose name had been lost. When investigators finally established that he was Keith Lovell Bibbs, they restored something fundamental to him, his identity. He was no longer an anonymous figure in an old case file. He had a name, an age, and a place in the historical record. The same principle applies to every other victim associated with the Eiler investigation. Their importance does not come from the notoriety of the man accused of killing them. It comes from the fact that they had lives that existed independently of him. Eiler's name became famous because of what investigators believed he had done. But the victims' names should not exist only as extensions of his story. Stephen Crockett should be remembered as Stephen Crockett, not simply as one of the victims attributed to the highway killer. Stephen Agon should be remembered as Stephen Agon, regardless of the unresolved questions surrounding the people Eiler accused of participating in his death. Daniel Bridges should be remembered as the 16-year-old whose murder produced the conviction, not merely as the legal case that sent Eiler to death row. And Keith Bibbs should be remembered as Keith Bibbs, not Adam Doe. The investigation also reminds us that justice operates on several different levels. A criminal conviction is one form of accountability. Identification of a victim is another form of justice, especially for families who have spent decades waiting to know what happened. The recovery of evidence and the reconstruction of a victim's final circumstances can provide another form of closure. None of these things can undo a killing, but each can help restore part of what violence attempted to erase. That is why the later identification of Bibbs mattered so much. It did not change the past. It did not answer every question surrounding his death, but it ensured that his name would no longer be lost. The same long-term effort applies to the other unresolved cases associated with Eiler. His confession to 21 additional murders provided information that could be compared with existing investigations. But the confession did not automatically settle every case. Some claims could be supported. Others remained uncertain. Some victims could be identified. Others required years of additional investigation. The process continued even after Eiler himself was gone. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of the case. A serial murder investigation is not ultimately about the mythology of the offender. It is about the people who were taken from their families and the work required to restore their identities and stories. The term highway killer may have become part of the public record, but it should never become the center of the human story. The center should be the victims. They were 14, 16, 17, 18, 19, 21, 23, 25 years old. They were young people whose futures were taken away. Their families were left with grief, uncertainty, and questions that sometimes lasted for decades. Some answers came through the courts. Some came through Eiler statements. Some came through investigative work. And some, like the identification of Keith Bibbs, came through science many years later. The final measure of the investigation is therefore not simply how many crimes can be attributed to Larry Eiler. It is how many victims can be named, remembered, and understood as individuals. Eiler died in 1994, but the victims did not disappear with him. Their cases remained. Their names remained. And, as the identification of Keith Bibbs demonstrated, the search for the truth could continue long after the person at the center of the investigation was gone. The story of Larry Eiler is difficult to summarize because the number of murders associated with his name is much larger than the number of crimes for which he was actually convicted. That distinction is not a technical footnote. It is one of the most important facts in understanding the case. Eiler was convicted of the murder of Daniel Bridges, a 16-year-old boy, and received a death sentence. The Illinois courts later upheld that sentence during the appeals process. But investigators believe that Bridges was only one victim in a much larger series. Before his death, Eiler confessed to 21 additional murders. His statements provided information that could potentially connect him to other cases. But those confessions did not create 21 additional convictions. The difference between what investigators believed, what Eiler admitted, and what a court could establish remained at the center of the case until the end. In a true crime story, there is always a temptation to turn an investigation into a simple sequence. A killer commits a series of murders. Police discover the pattern, the offender is arrested, and justice is delivered. The Eiler case did not follow such a clean path. Investigators suspected him before they could successfully prosecute him. Evidence that they believed might connect him to the murders was later affected by constitutional violations. He was released. The deaths continued. Eventually, the murder of Daniel Bridges produced a case strong enough to result in a conviction. And even after that conviction, investigators were left with a much larger collection of unresolved deaths. The legal history therefore matters because it shows exactly where certainty begins and where uncertainty remains. One of the clearest turning points came on September 30th, 1983, when Indiana police stopped Eiler on Interstate 65. Investigators already had reason to suspect that he might be connected to the murders. During the encounter, authorities obtained items they believe could be relevant, including Eiler's pickup truck, handcuffs, rope, and a knife with traces of blood. From the perspective of investigators, these materials potentially represented an important breakthrough. But the way Eiler was detained became the central legal issue. His attorney, David Shippers, challenged the legality of the detention and the evidence obtained during the encounter. Judge William Block ultimately determined that Eiler's continued detention after the initial traffic stop was unlawful and that the evidence gathered during the process was affected by constitutional violations. The result was devastating for the investigation. The evidence could not simply be used as investigators had intended, and Eiler was eventually released on February 6, 1984. This moment created one of the most haunting questions surrounding the case. What might have happened if the evidence had been admissible? The answer cannot be known. It would be speculation to say that every later murder would have been prevented or that a conviction would certainly have followed. What can be said is that investigators had already developed serious suspicions about Eiler. Yet the legal problems surrounding the 1983 encounter prevented them from using the evidence in the manner they had hoped. Eiler remained free. He moved to Chicago, where he lived at 1628 West Sherwin Avenue. His partner at the time was John Dobrovolsky's. Meanwhile, the broader investigation continued. Bodies were being discovered in different locations, and investigators increasingly believed that several cases could be connected. Eric Hansen, 18, was found on October 4, 1983, at Petrified Springs County Park in Wisconsin. His remains were decomposed and missing several parts, making identification difficult. The case illustrated the geographic reach of the investigation and the difficulties faced by authorities attempting to determine whether deaths in different jurisdictions belong to the same pattern. The investigation had to cross state boundaries, compare separate cases, and determine whether similarities were meaningful or coincidental. Then came Daniel Bridges. On August 21st, 1984, a janitor discovered bags containing human body parts in a garbage container near Eiler's Chicago apartment. The victim was identified as 16-year-old Daniel Bridges. Eiler was arrested that day. 2 days later, on August 23rd, prosecutors formally charged him with murder and concealment of the body. This case was different from the earlier investigation because authorities now had a direct connection between Eiler, his Chicago surroundings, and the remains of the victim. The prosecution could proceed without depending entirely on the evidence that had been suppressed. After the Interstate 65 encounter, Bridges became the case that finally produced a courtroom conviction. Eiler was convicted of his murder and sentenced to death. The Illinois courts later upheld the sentence. From a legal standpoint, this was the clearest resolution in the entire investigation. A jury had found Eiler guilty of Bridges' murder, and the sentence survived the subsequent appeals process. But that legal resolution could not automatically be extended to the other victims. Stephen Crockett, Delvoyd Baker, John Johnson, Stephen Agon, John Roach, Robert Foley, David Block, Irving Gibson, John Bartlett, Michael Bauer, Richard Wayne, Jay Reynolds, Gustavo Herrera, Jimmy Roberts, Daniel McNeve, Richard Bruce, John Brandenburg, Keith Bibbs, Ralph Calise, Eric Hansen, and others remained part of the broader investigative history. Some cases were linked to Eiler through investigative evidence. Some were included in his later confession, and some contained questions that remained unresolved. Stephen Agon's case provides an especially important example of this distinction. Eiler confessed to Agon's murder and later claimed that Robert David Little had participated with him. In 1991, Eiler testified against Little, yet Little was not convicted. The jury did not find sufficient evidence to establish his guilt. The absence of enough independent physical evidence meant that Eiler's accusation could not become a criminal conviction against Little. This outcome is important because it demonstrates the difference between an accusation and proof. Eiler could make a statement about another person, but the statement itself did not guarantee that the allegation was true. The courts required evidence sufficient to establish guilt. Little's acquittal, therefore, remained the legal outcome, regardless of the claims Eiler continued to make. The same principle applies to Eiler's final confessions. Before his death, he admitted responsibility for 21 additional murders. His attorney, Kathleen Zellner, later disclosed information about those confessions. According to the information provided, Eiler described circumstances surrounding the killings and gave investigators information about victims and locations. He also claimed that another person had assisted him in 4 murders and identified Robert Little in connection with those allegations. Again, however, the legal status of those claims was different from the Bridges conviction. Eiler's confession could provide investigative leads, but did not mean that every murder described in it had been proven in court, nor did it establish the guilt of another person merely because Eiler named them. This distinction is especially important when discussing the frequently cited figure of 21 additional murders. Saying that Eiler confessed to 21 killings is accurate within the information provided. Saying that he was convicted of 21 additional murders would not be accurate. The historical record has to preserve that difference. A confession can be powerful. It can provide details that help investigators understand an old case. It can potentially help identify a victim or clarify a location. But without independent evidence and a judicial determination, it remains a statement rather than a verdict. That problem became particularly significant with unidentified victims. One of the most striking examples was the young man known for decades as Adam Doe. His remains had been discovered in Indiana in 1983, but his identity remained unknown for approximately 40 years. In 2023, DNA and forensic genetic techniques identified him as Keith Lovell Bibbs. Bibbs had been 17 years old when he was killed. His identification demonstrated that even after Eiler's death, investigators could still make progress in cases associated with the broader investigation. Eiler died on March 6, 1994, from complications related to AIDS. He died in prison before his death sentence could be carried out. His death meant there could be no further prosecution of him for the additional killings he had confessed to. It also meant that investigators could never return to him with newly discovered evidence and demand explanations. Whatever information he had chosen to provide before his death was all that remained. The legal record, therefore, ended with a limited number of convictions, while the investigative record continued to contain a much larger number of cases. That gap is what makes the Eiler case so difficult to interpret. If we look only at convictions, we see a narrower story. Eiler was convicted of Daniel Bridges' murder and sentenced to death. If we look only at his confession, we see a much larger picture involving 21 additional killings. If we look at the investigative history, we see an even more complicated collection of victims and cases connected to Eiler by different types of evidence and suspicion. None of those perspectives should simply replace the others. They must be considered separately. For the victims' families, however, these legal distinctions could feel painfully abstract. Whether a death was formally proven in court did not change the fact that a loved one was gone. Whether a suspect was convicted did not necessarily answer every question about where a victim had been, how the death occurred, or whether someone else had participated. The criminal justice system could establish guilt in specific cases, but it could not automatically resolve every unanswered question surrounding a larger pattern of violence. That is why the later work of identifying victims remains so important. When Keith Bibbs was finally identified in 2023, the discovery did not produce another conviction. Eiler had been dead for decades, but it accomplished something else. It restored the identity of a 17-year-old who had been known only as Adam Doe for approximately 40 years. The result reminds us that justice is not always represented by a courtroom verdict alone. Sometimes it is represented by the restoration of name. Sometimes it is the confirmation of what happened to a missing person. Sometimes it is the preservation of an accurate historical record. And sometimes it is simply the refusal to allow an unidentified victim to remain forgotten. The Larry Eiler case ultimately leaves us with a difficult but necessary distinction. There is what was suspected. There is what Eiler confessed. There is what investigators believed. And there is what could be proven beyond the required legal standard. Those categories overlap, but they are not identical. Eiler's conviction for Daniel Bridges is a matter of legal fact. His confession to 21 additional murders is a matter of record. The broader list of victims connected to his name remains part of the investigative history. But each individual case must still be evaluated according to the evidence available. That careful distinction does not weaken the story. It makes the story more truthful. And in a case involving so many victims, preserving that truth matters. Because the purpose of remembering these murders should not be to make the killer's legend larger. It should be to ensure that the victims are remembered accurately, that uncertainty is acknowledged rather than concealed, and that every piece of evidence is treated according to what it can actually establish. Larry Eiler died in 1994. The legal proceedings against him ended, but the search for answers did not. Decades later, the identification of Keith Bibbs proved that even an old case can still yield new information. The final judgment of history, unlike a single courtroom verdict, remains open to new evidence. And for the victims and their families, that continuing search for truth may be the most important part of the story left behind.